The Lord of the Forbidden Abyss. Act 1, The First Stones. Chapter 1, The Verdict. The great hall of the Grafiya estate had never felt so cold. Issei stood at its center, the marble floor reflecting the orange light of late afternoon through tall stained glass windows depicting the 72 pillars of the underworld. He had stood in this hall 100 times before, for celebrations, for strategy meetings, for quiet evenings with Rias and the others. Tonight it felt like a courtroom, and in every sense, it was one. Around him stood a tribunal of devils he barely recognized. Representatives from the old Satan faction remnants, recently reinstated under a fragile peace accord. A trio of inquisitors from the Church of Lucifer, their robes a deep burgundy, their faces unreadable. And at the head of the assembly, seated upon a raised dais, was Diodora Astaroth's cousin, Velsarius Astaroth, recently appointed as Chief Magistrate of Underworld Internal Security. Issei, Velsarius said, his voice carrying easily across the hall without need of amplification. You stand accused of treason against the underworld. Specifically, of orchestrating a leak of classified Phoenix family research into sacred gear suppression technology to factions hostile to the devil aristocracy. That's a lie, Issei said. His voice was steady, though his hands, hidden behind his back, were clenched into fists. I never had access to that research. I never even knew it existed until 30 minutes ago, when I was summoned here. And yet, Velsarius continued, gesturing to a floating projection that flickered into existence beside him, we have intercepted communications, verified by 3 independent cryptographic analysts, showing transmissions originating from your personal communication crystal, sent to an undisclosed recipient believed to be affiliated with the Chaos Brigade remnant cells. The projection showed a string of encrypted code, utterly meaningless to Issei, attributed to a crystal frequency that was, supposedly, his own. I don't even know how to use half the functions on that thing, Issei said. Ask anyone. Ask Rias. Ask Aquino. They'll tell you I can barely send a message without help. A murmur went through the gathered devils. Issei searched the hall for familiar faces. He found none. Rias was not here. Aquino was not here. Not even Sona, who attended every formal underworld function as a matter of political necessity, was present. That absence told him everything he needed to know. This was not a trial. This was an execution dressed in the language of due process, and someone had made very sure that no one who might object was in the room to do so. The defendant's protests are noted, Velsarius said smoothly, but the evidence is conclusive. Furthermore, an independent investigation into the defendant's status as the host of the boosted gear has uncovered information that the Council finds deeply troubling. A second projection flickered to life. This one showed an ancient text, its script unfamiliar even to Issei, who had spent years around devils, fallen angels, and dragons of every description. Crimson sigils crawled across aged parchment, forming the rough outline of a massive serpentine creature with wings folded against the starless black backdrop. For 2 years, Velsarius said, the Sacred Gear Research Division has cross-referenced the resonance signature of your boosted gear against historical dragon archives. The conclusion, verified independently by the Astaroth and Phoenix clans, is this. The soul housed within your gauntlet is not that of Drake, the Welsh dragon, one of the 2 heavenly dragons. Issei's breath caught. The gauntlet on his left arm pulsed once, faintly, as if responding to the words. The soul within your sacred gear, Velsarius continued, his voice dropping to something almost reverent, almost frightened, belongs to an entity our oldest texts refer to only by a redacted designation. A being who existed before the current cosmological order. A being whose power was such that the heavens, the underworld, and the fallen all agreed, in one of the only unanimous decisions in recorded history, to erase every trace of its existence. We believe this entity to be what the old texts call, in translation, the Void Dragon Emperor. The hall went utterly silent. This is impossible, Issei said quietly. Inside his mind, in the place where a familiar gruff voice usually resided, there was only stillness. Whatever was listening, it was listening very carefully. Impossible or not, Velsarius said, the Council has reached its decision. Issei for the crime of treason against the underworld, and for the crime of harboring, whether knowingly or unknowingly, an entity classified as an absolute extinction-level threat. You are hereby stripped of your title as a devil of the Gremry household, stripped of your status as a sacred gear holder under official underworld protection, and sentenced to exile. Exile where? Issei demanded, finally letting his voice rise. You can't just throw someone into a void. There's nothing out there, it's not survivable. That, Velsarius said, and for the first time something like genuine fear flickered behind his composed expression, is precisely the point. Before Issei could move, before he could call on a single ounce of the power that had carried him through battles against gods and monsters, the magic circles beneath his feet flared to life. He recognized the formation immediately. He had seen it once before, in an old book in Azazel's library, a chapter on theoretical magic that the old Governor-General had laughed off as impossible to cast. A gate to the dimensional gap. Wait, Issei said. Wait, just let me explain. Let me talk to Rias, let me. The circle pulsed white, then black, then nothing at all. The great hall of the Gremry estate, with its stained glass windows and its tribunal of cowardly devils, vanished. For a moment, there was only sensation. Falling, except there was no ground to fall toward and no sky to fall from. Cold, except there was no temperature to measure it against. And silence, a silence so complete that Issei could hear his own heartbeat, slow and steady, the only proof that he still existed at all. Then, from somewhere deep inside him, in the space where Drake's voice should have been, something stirred. It was not the voice he expected. It was not gravelly, or proud, or laced with the dry humor he had grown used to over years of partnership. It was quiet, ancient, and it spoke directly into the marrow of his bones rather than into his ears. So, the voice said, they finally did it. After all these centuries of pretending I never existed, they finally worked up the nerve to throw the evidence away. Issei tried to speak, but in the dimensional gap, sound meant nothing. Thought, however, seemed to carry just fine. Who are you, he thought. What are you? Drake is real, the voice said. He existed. He fought in the war that ended my era, fought well, fought bravely, and when it was over, the survivors needed somewhere to put what remained of me so that I would never trouble the world again. They poured what was left of my essence into the same vessel that housed his soul, layered beneath him, sealed so deeply that even he likely never knew I was there. A failsafe. A grave, disguised as a treasure. The cold around Issei seemed to recede, just slightly, as if the void itself were listening. So what happens now, Issei thought. Am I dying? No, the voice said, and for the first time, something like amusement entered its tone. You are home. Or you will be, once we build it. This place killed every other living thing that has ever been cast into it. The gap erases. It unravels matter, unmakes souls, devours light itself. It could not erase me, because erasure was my domain before it was its own. And as long as you carry my essence within you, boy, it cannot erase you either. The void around them, the endless featureless black, seemed to ripple, very faintly, like the surface of dark water disturbed by a single dropped stone. They called it concept erasure, the voice continued. A clumsy translation. What I truly possessed was the power to decide what was real and what was not. To remove a concept from existence as cleanly as erasing a line of text. They feared it because they could not understand it, and they destroyed every record of me because they could not control it. And you're telling me this because, the Void Dragon Emperor said, and Issei felt something shift inside his own chest, something vast uncoiling from a sleep that had lasted longer than written history. I am tired of being a secret, Issei Hyodo. I am tired of being a footnote that frightened men erased out of fear. And you, it seems, have just been handed the same fate I was. Exiled. Erased from the records. Left to die in the one place that cannot kill either of us. The voice grew warmer, and stranger, and for the first time in longer than Issei could process, something that felt almost like hope flickered at the edges of his mind. So let us not die quietly. Let us build something here, in the one place in all of creation where no faction, no church, no council of cowards, can ever reach us again. And then, when it is finished, let us see how many of those frightened, exhausted souls out there in the world of factions and wars might want to come live in it. Issei floated in the endless black, the gauntlet on his arm beginning to glow with a color he had never seen it produce before. A deep violet shot through with threads of starless black, and for the first time since the magic circle had swallowed him whole, he felt something other than fear. He felt, despite everything, the faint and stubborn beginnings of a plan. All right, Issei said, or thought, or simply willed into the silence around him. Tell me everything. Tell me what you can do. And then let's figure out how to build a palace out of nothing. Far away, in a world that had just declared him dead, the gears of the underworld's political machine continued to turn, entirely unaware that the thing they feared most had not been destroyed at all. It had simply been given an empty universe, and all the time in it, to grow. Chapter 2, The First Stone. Nothing existed in the dimensional gap. That was the first lesson, and the hardest one for Issei to truly understand, because his entire life had been built on the assumption that things existed first, and were then shaped, built, or destroyed. Here, there was no raw material. No stone, no light, no air to breathe, though somehow he did not need to breathe at all. You're thinking about this wrong, the Void Dragon Emperor said. Its presence had settled into something steadier over what Issei guessed had been several hours, though time meant very little here. You keep waiting for something to be provided. There is nothing to provide. There is only the question of what you decide is real. How does that even work, Issei thought. I can't just decide a wall exists and have it exist. Can you not? Tell me, when Drake granted you boosted gears power, did the gauntlet appear because raw material assembled itself around your arm, or because the sacred gear's nature made it true that you now possessed it? Issei considered that. It just appeared. I didn't think about where the metal came from, precisely. Sacred gears do not obey material logic. Neither does this place, not anymore, not with us in it. The gap's natural state is absence. But absence is itself a kind of concept, and concepts are the one thing I have always been able to touch. The voice grew quieter, more focused, the way Issei imagined a teacher might sound when explaining something they considered both simple and vitally important. You will not build a palace here the way a mason builds with stone. You will define a palace into existence, piece by piece, by understanding clearly enough what each piece is, what it is for, and why it should exist. The clearer your understanding, the more solid the result. A vague wish produces a vague, unstable shape. A precise, considered idea produces something that will hold. Issei floated in the black for a long moment, turning the idea over. He thought about Risa's family castle, the towers and the stained glass and the long halls he had walked 1,000 times. He thought about how exhausted everyone always seemed after a long faction summit, how Sona used to rub her temples during budget meetings, how even Serafall, with her relentless cheerfulness, sometimes let her smile slip for half a second when she thought no one was looking. He thought about what it might mean to build somewhere that none of that exhaustion could follow. Not a castle, Issei thought slowly. Not something that looks like a seat of power. Something that looks like the opposite of that. Somewhere nobody has to perform for anyone else. Good, the voice said, and Issei could have sworn he felt something like approval radiating through his chest. Now, what is the first stone? Issei closed his eyes, which felt strange when there was no light to block out, and pictured it. A single block of crystal, clear as glass but warm in color, like sunlight trapped in amber. Not ornate. Not a throne, not a monument. Just a foundation stone, the kind a person might lay with their own hands, the first physical proof that something permanent could exist in a place built on nothing. He pictured its weight. Its texture. The way it would feel under his palm, slightly warm, humming faintly with a presence that was now half his own. Something pressed against his outstretched hand. Issei opened his eyes. Floating in the void in front of him, anchored to nothing, suspended in absolute black, was a single block of crystal roughly the size of a large footlocker. It glowed faintly from within, a deep amber light that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. He reached out and touched it, and it was solid. Warm. Real. There, the Void Dragon Emperor said, and for the first time, Issei heard something that was unmistakably pride in its voice. That is the first stone of the Forbidden Palace, Issei Hyodo. Everything else, every wall, every hall, Every room that will one day shelter someone who has nowhere else to go, begins here. Issei laughed, and the sound, swallowed instantly by the void around him, was the first sound either of them had made since arriving. It's going to take forever to build a whole palace one block at a time, he thought. It would, the voice agreed, if you were doing it alone, and if you were doing it only with your hands. But you forget what you are, boy. You are the host of a sacred gear that, even sealed and diminished as I currently am, retains a fraction of its old nature. Concept erasure was always paired, in the old texts, with its counterpart. The power to remove a thing from existence is, at its root, the same power as the ability to define a thing into existence. Erasure and Genesis. Two sides of a single coin, and you, right now, hold that coin. The crystal block in front of Issei began to glow brighter, and beside it, slowly, a second block began to take shape, as if drawn from the empty air itself, mirroring the first. Think bigger, the Void Dragon Emperor said. Think of an entire foundation. Then a floor. Then walls. You will tire quickly at first. This place demands a great deal from anyone who tries to impose order on it, but you will also grow stronger faster than you can imagine, because every act of creation here is also an act of training, for both of us. Issei stared at the two glowing blocks, drifting gently in the void, the only two solid things in an infinite expanse of nothing. He thought about Rias, who had not been at his trial. He thought about Aquino, and Sona, and all the people whose absence had told him exactly how little protection his years of service to the Gremery household had actually bought him. And then he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, about the people who might have come, if they had known. The people who had always seemed to be fighting battles within their own factions as much as against outside enemies. People who, he suspected, might understand exactly what it felt like to be discarded by the system they had spent their entire lives propping up. He thought of one person in particular, a woman with silver hair and dark crimson eyes who had once, in a quiet, unguarded moment after a long council session, told him that she sometimes envied people who had nowhere important to be. Build it big enough for guests, Issei thought, and felt the void around him shiver, very slightly, in response. Now you are beginning to understand, the Void Dragon Emperor said. Concept erasure removed things that should not exist. Its counterpart can create things that should. And right now, somewhere in that world you were exiled from, there are people who very much should have somewhere safe to go. Issei reached out and placed both hands on the first crystal block, feeling its warmth seep into his palms, and for the first time since the magic circle had taken him, he allowed himself to imagine, in real detail, what he was about to build. A palace with no throne. A sanctuary with no politics. A place where the only rule would be that everyone inside it was finally, completely safe. All right, Issei said aloud, his voice swallowed instantly by the dark, though he no longer minded. Let's get to work. Behind him, and around him, and through every direction at once, the first faint outline of a foundation began, slowly, to glow. Chapter 3, The Queen's Burden. 3 weeks passed in the world above, though Issei had no way of marking the time. In the dimensional gap, he measured progress not in days but in completed rooms, and by the time the world's calendar would have read 3 weeks, he had completed 11. The foundation had grown into a sprawling structure of pale amber crystal, its walls translucent enough to let through a soft inner light that came from nowhere and everywhere, since there was no sun to provide it. Long galleries stretched in every direction, their floors smooth and warm underfoot. A great central hall, larger than the Gremery ballroom, rose in tiers toward a ceiling that seemed to fade into a painted simulation of a night sky, stars that Issei had designed himself, scattered in patterns that looked nothing like the constellations of the world above and everything like the patterns he remembered from the few peaceful nights he had spent stargazing with friends. He had built a library, a kitchen, though he was still working out whether food could exist here in any meaningful sense, or whether eating was simply another concept he needed to define carefully enough to make real. He had built a dozen private chambers, each different, each designed with a specific kind of person in mind, though he had not let himself think too hard about who, specifically, those people might be. He had also, almost as an afterthought, built a training hall. Tall enough that even a dragon could stretch its wings inside it, reinforced with layers of crystal dense enough to withstand attacks that would level a city. The Void Dragon Emperor had insisted on this one. A sanctuary that cannot defend itself, it had said, is just a very comfortable trap. We will make sure that anyone who comes here is safer inside these walls than they have ever been anywhere else in their lives. That includes safety from anyone who might come looking for them. Issei was standing in the central hall, running his palm along a section of wall that he had just finished, watching the crystal catch the ambient light and scatter it into soft, shifting colors. When the Void Dragon Emperor spoke again, its tone different from the calm instructional voice it usually used. Issei. Something is happening above us. I can feel it through the boundary between this place and the world you came from. A presence. Powerful. Familiar to you, I think. Issei straightened. Familiar how? It is bleeding power into the gap between worlds. Not an attack. More like grief. Overwhelming, barely restrained grief, channeled through enormous magical strength because that strength has nowhere else to go. Issei thought immediately of several people who might fit that description, and his stomach tightened at all of them. Can you tell where? Close. Very close to the boundary of what we have built here. As if something, or someone, has been thrown toward the edge of the gap and is fighting not to be consumed by it. Issei did not hesitate. He had spent 3 weeks learning what this place would allow him to do, and one of the first things he had mastered, almost without meaning to, was the ability to move quickly across vast distances within his own palace and the space immediately surrounding it, simply by deciding clearly enough where he needed to be. He decided he needed to be wherever that presence was. The amber halls blurred around him, and then he was outside the palace walls, in the open black expanse of the gap, and ahead of him, suspended in the void exactly as he had been 3 weeks ago, was a woman. Issei recognized her instantly. Silver hair, longer than he remembered, drifting weightlessly around her in the absence of gravity. A maid's uniform, torn at one shoulder, scorched along one side as if she had walked through fire to get here. Dark crimson eyes, wide open, fixed on nothing, the eyes of someone who had used every ounce of strength they had and had nothing left to fight with. Grafiya Lucifuge, the strongest queen, wife of the Crimson Satan Lucifer himself, was floating alone in the dimensional gap, and the void around her was beginning, very slowly, to fray at the edges, the same slow unraveling that had nearly claimed Issei 3 weeks ago. Grafiya. His voice meant nothing here, but his presence apparently did, because her eyes snapped toward him, and for a moment, raw shock broke through the exhaustion on her face. Issei, she said, or thought, the word arriving in his mind the same way the Void Dragon Emperor's voice always did. You're alive. They said they told everyone you were. I know what they told everyone, Issei said, closing the distance between them in an instant, reaching out and catching her hand before the fraying edges of the void could reach any closer. The moment his fingers closed around hers, the unraveling stopped, the way a held flame stops spreading the moment it is starved of air. I'll explain everything, I promise. But first, what happened to you? Why are you here? Grafia's composure, the legendary iron composure that had earned her the title of strongest queen, cracked, just slightly, at the edges. There was an attempt on Serzex's life, she said. During the same council session that exiled you, as it turns out, though I did not learn of your exile until afterward. The attempt failed. Serzex survived. But in the aftermath, certain factions within the council decided that my methods, in defending him, were excessive. Unbecoming of a Satan's wife. They have spent the last 3 weeks systematically removing me from every position of authority I have ever held, on the grounds that a queen who responds to assassination attempts with, and I quote, disproportionate lethal force, represents a liability to the image of the new underworld. Her hand tightened around his, and for the first time, Issei saw something in her crimson eyes that he had never seen there before in all the years he had known her. Not anger. Not even grief, exactly. Exhaustion. Absolute, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that came from centuries of being the strongest person in every room and never once being allowed to simply be tired. Serzex did not stop them, she said quietly. He apologized to me, privately, and told me that politically his hands were tied. And then, an hour ago, I was informed that as part of and again I quote, mutually agreeable restructuring of household arrangements. My marriage to Serzex is to be formally annulled, effective at the end of this month, to allow him to pursue a politically advantageous union with a representative of the reinstated old Satan faction. Issei felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest, a feeling he recognized from 3 weeks ago, standing in the great hall, listening to a tribunal explain why the people he had given everything to were throwing him away. They threw you out, Issei said. Just like they did to me. I did not have anywhere to go, Grafiya said, and her voice, even through the strange wordless connection of the void, sounded smaller than Issei had ever heard it. I have served the Gremry and Lucifer households since before you were born, Issei. I do not know how to exist outside of service. I was standing at the edge of the old observatory, trying to think of where to go next, when the floor beneath me gave way without warning. A failing ward, perhaps, left untended after my removal from the household's protections. I fell before I understood what was happening. That's not your fault, Issei said firmly. None of this is your fault. They left you unprotected, whether on purpose or through neglect, and either way, that is on them, not you. Grafiya looked at him, and something in his expression, something fierce and protective and utterly without the deference she was used to seeing from him, seemed to startle her. Come with me, Issei said. I built something. It's not finished, not even close, but there's a room, there's a whole wing actually, that I think might be exactly what you need right now. Somewhere nobody can annul anything, or restructure anything, or tell you that the way you protect the people you love is unbecoming. Issei, Grafiya said slowly, what exactly have you been doing for the last 3 weeks? Issei looked back toward the palace, its amber walls glowing softly against the endless black, vast and warm and entirely, completely his. Building a place where people like us don't have to be afraid of being thrown away anymore, he said. Come on. I'll show you. He did not let go of her hand as he led her toward the gates of the Forbidden Palace, and for the first time since arriving in the Gap, the Void Dragon Emperor's presence inside him went quiet in a way that felt less like watching and more like something Issei could only describe, hesitantly, as approval. One stone at a time, the voice murmured, so softly Issei almost missed it. And now, the first guest. Chapter 4, The Sanctuary Takes Shape. Grafiya stood in the entrance hall of the Forbidden Palace, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely nothing to do. There was no schedule to manage, no correspondence to review, no household staff awaiting her instruction, no diplomatic crisis requiring her quiet, efficient intervention before anyone important even noticed it had occurred. There was only the soft amber light filtering through the crystal walls, and the faint, distant sound of something that might have been wind, though Issei had told her there was no air here to make wind, only the impression of one, because he had decided that a place meant for rest should sound restful. It's a lot to take in, Issei said, watching her reaction carefully. I know it's strange. I'm still getting used to it myself. Strange, Grafiya repeated, is one word for it. She turned slowly, taking in the soaring ceiling, the gentle curve of the walls, the complete absence of any of the architectural language she associated with power. No thrones. No sigils of House Lucifer or House Gremry. No portraits, no banners, no symbols of rank at all. Issei, do you understand what you have built? Do you understand what this place represents strategically? Issei blinked. Strategically? I just wanted somewhere people could rest. That is precisely my point. Grafia's exhaustion had not vanished, but something in her posture had shifted, the rigid formality easing slightly, as if some long-held tension had found, for the first time, somewhere safe to set itself down. A location outside the jurisdiction of every faction in existence. A location that, by its very nature, cannot be found, cannot be sieged, and cannot be reached except by someone who already possesses the means to survive the dimensional gap itself. You have built something that no army, no council, no faction, has any way of threatening. I guess I did, Issei said slowly, as if hearing the idea out loud for the first time made it real in a way it hadn't been before. And you intend to fill it, Grafiya continued, with people the underworld's political machine has decided to discard. Issei thought about that for a moment. He thought about Sona's tired eyes during budget meetings. About Serafall's smiles slipping. About a dozen other faces, people who had spent their entire lives holding up a system that, the moment it grew inconvenient, had shown exactly how willing it was to throw them away, the same way it had thrown away him, and now Grafiya. Yeah, he said. I guess I do. Grafiya studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression, something Issei couldn't quite name, softened. Then you have built, whether you intended it or not, the single most dangerous structure in the history of the underworld, she said. Not because of any weapon it contains. Because of who it might one day shelter, and what they might decide to do, once they realize they no longer have anything left to lose by doing it. I don't want it to be a weapon, Issei said quickly. I just want it to be safe. I know, Grafiya said, and for the first time since he had found her in the void, she smiled, small and tired but genuine. That is precisely why it will become one anyway. The most dangerous things are rarely built by people who intend danger. They are built by people who simply refuse to let the people they care about be hurt anymore. She walked further into the hall, trailing her fingers along the crystal wall, watching the light shift and ripple beneath her touch. Show me the rest, she said. All of it. If I am going to stay here, and Issei, I think I am, then I want to understand exactly what we have, and exactly what it might become. Issei felt something settle in his chest at the word we, a small thing, but it landed with unexpected weight. Over the next several hours, measured only by the slow progression of completed rooms, Issei showed her everything. The library, its shelves currently mostly empty but for a handful of books he had managed to define into existence by recalling, in painstaking detail, texts he had read once and barely remembered. The training hall, vast enough for a dragon to stretch its wings, its walls humming faintly with defensive enchantments the Void Dragon Emperor had helped him weave directly into the crystal itself. The kitchen, where, to both their surprise, food turned out to be perfectly possible to create, provided Issei understood clearly enough what he was making and, more importantly, why. Why does the why matter? Grafiya asked, watching him carefully assemble a pot of tea that smelled, against all logic, exactly like the tea Akino used to make on quiet afternoons. I'm honestly not sure, Issei admitted. But every time I try to make something just because I think it should exist, it comes out kind of flat. Almost right, but not quite. And every time I make something because I remember exactly what it meant to someone, why it mattered, it just works. Better, I mean. More real. Grafiya accepted the cup he offered her, and took a slow sip, and her eyes widened slightly. This is exactly how Akino makes it, she said. I know, Issei said. I used to watch her make it for Rias on bad days. I think I understood, even back then, why it helped. I just never thought about it as something I might need to understand on purpose. Grafiya was quiet for a long moment, holding the warm cup in both hands, looking down into it. Issei, she said eventually, may I ask you something, and may I ask that you answer honestly, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable? Of course. When you built this place, Grafiya said, who were you picturing? Not in the abstract. Specifically? Whose faces did you see when you decided this needed to exist? Issei felt his face warm slightly, and he was grateful, for once, that there was no harsh light here to make a blush obvious. Honestly? He said. At first, I think I was just thinking about myself. About not wanting to disappear quietly. But then, almost right away, I started thinking about everyone who's ever looked exhausted in a room full of people who were supposed to be on their side. Sona. Serafall. You, actually, though I didn't know what had happened to you yet. Even Rias, sometimes, in the early days before things got better for her specifically. And what, Grafiya asked carefully, did you feel, when you thought about us? Issei considered the question seriously, because something in the careful way Grafiya had asked it told him it mattered, more than the casual tone suggested. I felt like it wasn't fair, he said finally. That people who give everything, who hold everything together, never get to put anything down. And I felt like if I ever had the chance, even a small one, I'd want to be the kind of person who could give that to someone. Even just for a little while. Even if it never went anywhere beyond that. Grafiya set down her cup, very carefully, on the smooth crystal counter. Issei, she said, do you have any idea how rare that is? An offer with absolutely nothing attached to it. No political advantage sought. No favor expected in return. Simply rest, offered freely, by someone with the power to give it, and the choice not to ask for anything back. I mean, Issei said, slightly flustered, I'd hope I'd offer it either way, but I guess if it's not weird to say, I wouldn't exactly mind if people wanted to, you know. Stick around. After they're rested. If they wanted to. Grafiya laughed, a soft, surprised sound, and the warmth in it was unmistakable. No, she said. I do not think that is weird at all. She looked around the hall once more, at the soft amber light, the painted stars overhead, the complete and total absence of anything that demanded anything of her, and something in her shoulders, some weight she had carried for centuries without ever once setting it down, eased, just slightly, for the first time. Then I accept your offer, Issei Hyodo, she said. Not as a queen. Not as anyone's wife, not anymore. Simply as Grafiya. And I think, if you will permit me, I would like to help you finish building this place. Properly. Because I suspect you are about to have a great many more guests than you currently realize, and a palace this size does not furnish itself. Deal, Issei said, smiling for what felt like the first time in 3 weeks. Far above them, in the world of factions and councils and carefully worded press releases, the underworld continued operating exactly as it always had, utterly unaware that 2 of the people it had just discarded were, at that very moment, sitting together in a kitchen made of crystal and starlight, drinking tea, and quietly beginning to plan something that would, in time, change everything. Chapter 5: The Leviathan's Mask. 6 weeks after Issei's exile, the Forbidden Palace had grown to encompass 3 full wings, a garden that should not have been able to exist, and a small lake whose water, Issei had eventually decided, came from the concept of rain he remembered from a particularly peaceful afternoon in Ko, before everything had become about factions and politics and survival. Grafiya had taken to the work of furnishing and organizing the palace with the same quiet, relentless efficiency she had once applied to managing the affairs of 2 of the most powerful households in the underworld, except now, for the first time, she was doing it for no one's benefit but her own, and for the benefit of whoever might come next. There will be others, she had told Issei, on their 3rd week working together. I am certain of it. The current political climate in the underworld is, to put it mildly, unstable. The old Satan faction's reinstatement has created a great deal of pressure on anyone whose position depends on the goodwill of multiple competing factions at once. And there are very few positions more precarious, right now, than those held by powerful women whose strength makes certain factions uncomfortable. She had been right, of course. Grafiya usually was. It was during the 7th week, while Issei was in the training hall working with the Void Dragon Emperor on a technique that involved, as far as Issei could tell, learning to define the absence of an attack rather than blocking it, that the same faint tremor in the boundary between worlds that had announced Grafiya's arrival made itself known again. This time, the presence felt different. Smaller, in terms of raw magical pressure, but somehow more frantic, like a bird beating itself against the window it could not understand was there. Another one, the Void Dragon Emperor said, sounding almost resigned, though Issei could feel an undercurrent of something warmer beneath the dry tone. Closer to the southern boundary this time. Go. I will hold the training circle open, we are not finished. Issei was already moving. He found her curled in on herself, drifting in the black, and for a moment he genuinely did not recognize her, because the person in front of him bore almost no resemblance to the cheerful, theatrical figure he was used to seeing on broadcasts and at council meetings, all magical girl poses and exaggerated catchphrases. Serafall Leviathan, one of the 4 great Satans, looked smaller than Issei had ever seen her. Her elaborate costume was gone, replaced by simple dark robes. Her hair, usually styled with careful precision, hung loose and unkempt around a face that looked, more than anything else, like the face of someone who had not slept properly in a very long time. Serafall. Her eyes opened at the sound, or the impression, of his voice, and for a moment, raw panic flickered across her face before recognition set in. Issei-kun? Her voice, when it reached him, was smaller and more uncertain than he had ever heard it. They said you were. Oh, thank goodness, you're really here. I thought I was finally. Hey, it's okay, Issei said, closing the distance and catching her hands before the fraying edges of the void could reach her, the same way he had with Grafiya weeks before. The unraveling stopped instantly. I've got you. You're safe. What happened, Serafall? What are you doing out here? For a long moment, Serafall said nothing at all, and Issei realized, with a small shock, that the Satan of the Leviathan house, one of the most powerful beings in the underworld, was trying very hard not to cry, and was failing. I resigned, she said finally. This morning. Or, well, I suppose I was encouraged to resign, very strongly, by the rest of the council, but the official records will say I resigned voluntarily, for personal reasons. Why? Issei asked gently. Because of Sona, Serafall said, and her voice cracked on the name. There was a vote, last week, about the Citri family's territorial holdings. Sona argued against a proposal that would have benefited the reinstated old Satan factions at the expense of several smaller houses, including some that have no real political power of their own and absolutely needed someone to speak for them. She argued well. Too well, apparently, because the proposal failed. That sounds like a good thing, Issei said carefully. It was a good thing, Serafall said. For about 2 days. And then certain members of the council quietly informed me that my sister's continued, and I quote, disruptive influence on underworld policy reflected poorly on my judgment as both a Satan and as the head of her household, and that perhaps it was time for fresh leadership in the Leviathan seat. Someone less, emotionally invested in protecting minor houses that don't matter to anyone important. Issei felt that same cold, sharp feeling settle in his chest again, the one he had felt listening to his own tribunal, the one he had felt listening to Grafiya's story. They threatened to go after Sona, Issei said slowly, unless you step down. They were very polite about it, Serafall said, with a brittle little laugh that had no humor in it at all. They always are. Nobody ever says anything directly. They just mention things. Possibilities. Concerns. And you understand very quickly exactly what is being asked of you, and exactly what will happen if you refuse to give it. So you step down. I stepped down, Serafall confirmed. And I told Sona it was because I was tired, which, frankly, was not even a lie. And then I walked to the edge of the Lucifuge family's old observatory, which has been abandoned for years, ever since, well. She glanced away. Ever since certain restructurings. And I sat there, and I thought about how strange it was that I have spent my entire life being the strong one, the cheerful one, the one everyone could rely on no matter what, and the moment that strength became inconvenient for the people actually running things, it took them less than a week to fold me up and put me away. And then? Issei prompted softly. And then, Serafall said, the same observatory floor that has stood since before I held this seat simply gave out beneath me. No warning. I imagine the old wards have been neglected for years, since the building was decommissioned, and nobody thought to check on it before quietly stripping away whatever protections still remained around me. One moment I was sitting at the edge, and the next, there was no edge at all. Serafall, Issei said quietly, that's not an accident. Not really. Not the timing of it. I know, Serafall admitted, her voice small. I think some part of me knew the moment it happened. But Issei-kun, the strangest thing was, right as I felt myself falling, I felt something else too. A presence, far away, faint, but unmistakably warm. I'd felt it once before, weeks ago, right around the time everyone was told you had died in the gap. And I thought, if anyone could possibly survive falling into something like this, it would be you. So I held on to that thought, the whole way down. Issei held her hands tighter. You don't belong in a void, Serafall, he said firmly. You belong somewhere safe. And I've got somewhere safe. Come on. He led her toward the palace, its amber light visible now even from a considerable distance, glowing warm against the endless black, and Serafall stared at it with an expression of dawning, disbelieving wonder. Issei-kun, she said slowly, did you build that? With some help, Issei said. Come on. There's tea. And Grafiya's here, actually, she'll probably want to talk strategy with you at some point, but not tonight. Tonight you're just going to rest. Grafiya-san is here? Serafall's voice wavered between surprise and something that sounded almost like relief at the idea of a familiar face. Issei-kun, what exactly is this place? Issei thought about how to answer that, and found, to his own surprise, that the answer had become clearer to him with every guest who arrived. It's a place for people the system decided it didn't need anymore, he said. And honestly? I think that system is about to find out exactly how big a mistake that was. Behind him, faint and warm, he felt the Void Dragon Emperor's approval ripple through him once more, and ahead of him, the gates of the Forbidden Palace, larger now than they had been even a few hours ago, as if responding to the simple fact that someone new was about to walk through them, glowed brighter against the dark. 2 stones, the ancient voice murmured. And growing. Chapter 6. The Council of the Discarded. By the time Serafall had slept, truly slept, for the first time in what she admitted was probably close to a year, the Forbidden Palace had grown again, almost as if it had been waiting for a reason to expand. A 4th wing had taken shape overnight, its rooms arranged in a loose circle around a central courtyard where Issei had planted something that, after a great deal of careful thought about what a garden was actually for, had grown into rows of flowering trees unlike anything that existed in the world above, their blossoms a soft, glowing violet that matched the color of the Void Dragon Emperor's power. You're getting faster, Grafiya observed, walking beside Issei through the new wing, watching the crystal walls catch and refract the violet light from the courtyard beyond. 6 weeks ago, a single room took you most of a day. This entire wing appeared in a matter of hours. The Emperor says it's because I understand the place better now, Issei said. Like the first few rooms, I was kind of guessing at what would make people feel safe. Now I actually know, because I've watched it work. It has worked, Grafiya agreed. Serafall slept for 14 hours. I do not believe she has slept for more than 4 at a time in years. They found Serafall in the courtyard, sitting cross-legged beneath one of the violet trees, looking, for the first time since her arrival, something closer to her old self, though quieter, less performative, as if the elaborate cheerfulness she usually projected had been a costume she no longer felt the need to wear. Issei-kun, she said, looking up as they approached. This place is impossible. I've been sitting here for an hour trying to figure out how a garden exists inside the dimensional gap, and I've concluded that the only answer is that you simply decided it should, and reality agreed with you out of sheer exhaustion. That's actually pretty close to how it works, Issei admitted, sitting down across from her. How are you feeling? Rested, Serafall said, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face. Which is strange, because I keep waiting to feel guilty about it. Sona is still up there. The council is still up there. And here I am, sitting under a tree that shouldn't exist, feeling more at peace than I have in years. You don't have to feel guilty, Issei said. And for what it's worth, I don't think this has to be the end of anything. Just a place to start from. Somewhere safe enough that you can think clearly about what happens next, instead of being run ragged until you can't think at all. Serafall studied him for a long moment. Grafiya-san told me what you said to her, she said. About wanting to give people somewhere to put things down, with nothing attached. I have spent my entire life as a Satan being approached by people who wanted something from me, Issei-kun. Alliances, favors, my signature on documents I barely had time to read. Do you have any idea how rare it is, to be offered something, anything, with absolutely no strings attached? Grafiya said something like that too, Issei said, a little sheepishly. Then perhaps you should start believing it, Serafall said, smiling, and for a moment the warmth in her expression was unmistakably genuine, unguarded in a way Issei had never seen from her before. Issei-kun, I think I would like to stay here as well. Not forever, necessarily. But for now. And I think, given a little time to rest properly, I might actually be useful to you. I know more about the inner workings of underworld politics than almost anyone alive. If you're serious about this place becoming somewhere that protects people the system discards, you're going to need someone who understands exactly how that system works, so you know which threats are real and which are just noise. I'd like that, Issei said. A lot, actually. That evening, measured by the dimming of the courtyard's violet light into something softer, the 3 of them sat together in the new wing's central room, a space Issei had built without quite knowing what it was for until it was finished, a long table surrounded by comfortable chairs, more like a family dining room than any formal council chamber. We should talk about what comes next, Grafiya said, settling into one of the chairs with a cup of tea. Issei, I do not say this to alarm you, but you should understand that what has happened to the three of us is unlikely to be an isolated pattern. The political restructuring currently underway in the underworld is systematically removing anyone whose strength or independence makes them inconvenient to the factions currently consolidating power. Myself, Serafall, and you, the host of a sacred gear they decided was too dangerous to exist. You think there will be more people, Issei said. I think, Grafiya said carefully, that within the next several months, there will be a number of individuals, likely women in positions of significant power, who find themselves suddenly and conveniently removed from influence, under circumstances that will be described, publicly, as voluntary, or as accidents, or as the natural consequence of restructuring. And I think some of them, the ones whose strength is genuinely their own rather than borrowed from a title, may find their way here, the same way Serafall and I did. Then we keep building, Issei said simply. Rooms for whoever needs them. And we make sure that whatever's happening up there, whoever's doing this, eventually realizes that every single person they discard is just ending up somewhere they can't touch anymore. There is something else, the Void Dragon Emperor said, its voice resonating through the room in a way that made both Grafiya and Serafall look up, startled, having apparently not expected to hear it directly. Issei, while you were resting, I have been listening. To the boundary. There is a great deal of activity in the world above, much of it centered around a search. A search for what? Issei asked. For you, the Void Dragon Emperor said. Specifically for evidence of what truly happened to the boosted gear's bearer after his exile. The official records claim you were consumed by the gap within hours, as expected. But there is a faction, small, currently without significant power, that does not believe this. They have been quietly investigating for weeks. Do we know who? Grafiya asked sharply, her exhaustion giving way instantly to the focused alertness Issei recognized from her years as the strongest queen. A young woman, the Void Dragon Emperor said. A Valkyrie, formerly of Odin's service, more recently attached to the Gremry household as a tutor and combat instructor. She has apparently been conducting her own investigation, independent of any official sanction, and has recently come into possession of information that the Council would very much prefer remain buried. Issei felt his chest tighten. He knew exactly who the Void Dragon Emperor was describing. Rossweiss, he said quietly. She is getting close, the Void Dragon Emperor said. Closer than the Council realizes. And Issei, I should warn you. The information she is uncovering is the kind of information that, in the world above, tends to make a person extremely unpopular with the people who buried it in the first place. Issei looked at Grafiya, and at Serafall, and saw the same understanding dawning on both their faces that he felt settling into his own chest. Somewhere in the world above, in the world that had declared him dead and quietly discarded two of the strongest people he had ever known, someone else was about to dig too deep, ask too many of the right questions, and discover exactly how dangerous the truth could be to the people determined to keep it buried. We need to be ready, Issei said. If she finds out the truth, and they realize she knows, she's going to need somewhere to go. Fast. Then, Grafiya said, setting down her cup, the old efficiency settling back over her like a familiar coat, I suggest we make sure this palace has somewhere ready for her. Sooner rather than later. Outside, in the endless black beyond the crystal walls, the violet blossoms of the courtyard trees swayed gently in a wind that did not exist, and far above, in a world of councils and factions and carefully buried secrets, a young woman with silver hair and sharp gray eyes sat alone in a small office late at night, staring at a document she was not supposed to have found, and realized, with a slow and sinking certainty, that she had just discovered something that was going to get her killed. She read it again, just to be certain, and then, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rossweiss allowed herself to be afraid. The Lord of the Forbidden Abyss. Act 2, The Council of the Discarded. Chapter 7, What the Valkyrie Found. Rossweiss had read the document 7 times now, and each time, the words refused to rearrange themselves into anything less alarming. It had started 3 weeks ago, with something so small she had almost dismissed it. A line item in a routine budget transfer, the kind of thing that crossed her desk a dozen times a day in her role assisting with the Gremery household's administrative affairs. A transfer of funds from an account she did not recognize, to a research division she had never heard of, with a memo field that simply read, in clipped bureaucratic shorthand, Sacred Gear Disposition, Case 0017 Final. Case 0017 was Issei's case number. She knew that because she had pulled his personnel file the day after his trial, the day after Rias had come home pale and shaking and unable to explain why she hadn't been told the tribunal was even happening until it was already over. Rossweiss had spent the following weeks doing what she did best, which was research, careful and methodical and entirely off the books, because she had learned very quickly that asking direct questions about Issei's case through official channels resulted in polite, vague non-answers and, on one occasion, a quiet visit from a counsel aide who suggested, with exquisite politeness, that continuing to pursue the matter might reflect poorly on the Gremery household's standing with the reinstated factions. She had kept going anyway, because Issei had been her student, in a strange roundabout way, during her time as a tutor for the Gremery peerage, and because the more she dug, the more obvious it became that something about his exile did not add up. The document in front of her now was the answer to all of it, and it was so much worse than she had imagined. It was a research summary, dated nearly 2 centuries ago, classified at a level Rossweiss had never even seen used before, originating from a joint research division operated, according to the header, by representatives of the 3 biblical factions working in secret cooperation, a fact so politically explosive on its own that Rossweiss had to read past it twice before she could focus on the actual content. The summary described, in clinical detail, the discovery of a second consciousness sealed within the artifact known as boosted gear, beneath the soul of Drake the Welsh dragon. It described, in even more clinical detail, the nature of that consciousness, an entity the document referred to only by the redacted designation Subject 0, and its associated ability, also redacted but described functionally as the unmaking of established reality at a conceptual level. And it described, in a final section dated only 6 months ago, an addendum. A recommendation, approved by representatives of all 3 factions, that given recent instability in sacred gear resonance readings from the current boosted gear host, immediate action should be taken to neutralize the threat before Subject 0 could achieve what the addendum called, chillingly, awakening. The recommended action had been exiled to the dimensional gap, unfabricated treason charges, with the expectation that the gap itself would, in the document's own words, complete the disposal naturally, without requiring any faction to be formally implicated in the destruction of a sacred gear host. Rossweiss set the document down with hands that were not quite steady. They hadn't exiled Issei because they believed he was a traitor. They had exiled him because they were afraid of what he was carrying, and they had engineered his death, using the gap as a weapon, specifically so that no one could ever be held accountable for it. And the most recent addendum, dated only 4 days ago, was the part that frightened her most of all. Subject's continued survival within the gap now confirmed via resonance tracking, contrary to initial projections. Subject 0's signature has not weakened, and preliminary readings suggest active stabilization of localized space within the gap, consistent with intentional structure formation. Recommend immediate reassessment of containment protocols. Subject 0 may be, contrary to original threat models, not merely surviving, but adapting. He was alive. Issei was alive, and whoever had written this addendum knew it, and the document's tone, the careful, frightened precision of its language, told Rossweiss that the people who had engineered his exile were now, for the first time, genuinely afraid of what they had created. A knock at her office door made her jump so violently she nearly knocked over her tea. Rossweiss? Aquino's voice, muffled through the door. Are you still up? Rias wanted to know if you'd seen the budget transfer logs from this morning. There's some kind of discrepancy in. One moment, Rossweiss called, her voice coming out higher than she intended. She swept the document into a drawer, locked it with a quick incantation, and took a steadying breath before opening the door. Aquino's expression shifted the moment she saw her, from casual to immediately, sharply concerned. Rossweiss, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, Rossweiss said too quickly. Just tired. Long night. Aquino studied her for a long moment, and Rossweiss had the distinct impression that Aquino did not believe her for 1 second, but was choosing, for now, not to push. All right, Aquino said slowly. Well, get some sleep. You've been working yourself ragged lately, and Rias has been worried about you, on top of everything else she's already worried about. After Aquino left, Rossweiss sat back down at her desk, staring at the locked drawer, and tried to think clearly through the fear pounding in her chest. She could tell Rias. Rias, more than anyone, deserved to know the truth about what had really happened to Issei. But telling Rias meant telling someone with an official position, someone whose reactions would be watched, monitored, reported on by the same factions who had buried this information in the first place. If Rias reacted visibly, if she did anything that suggested she had learned the truth, it would not take long for someone to connect the dots back to whoever had told her. And the addendum had made one thing very clear. The people who had buried this information were now actively monitoring for any sign that it had resurfaced. Rossweiss looked at the small magic detection rune she kept on her desk, a habit from her time in Odin's service, designed to alert her to any unauthorized scrying or surveillance magic in her vicinity. It was glowing, faintly, and had been, she realized with a cold lurch, for several hours. Someone was watching her. Someone had been watching her for hours, possibly since the moment she had first accessed the document. Rossweiss stood up so quickly her chair nearly tipped over, her mind racing through every possible option, and landing, again and again, on the same uncomfortable truth. She had found something that powerful people desperately wanted to stay buried, and now they knew that she knew. She had, at most hours before someone decided that the cleanest solution to a leak was the same solution they had already used once before. Rossweiss looked toward the window, toward the night sky outside, toward a direction that, she realized with a strange, sudden certainty, she had absolutely no way of actually traveling to. Issei was alive, somewhere in the dimensional gap, building something that terrified the most powerful factions in 3 different religious orders. And Rossweiss, currently sitting alone in an office with the surveillance rune glowing ominously on her desk, had absolutely no idea how she was going to reach him before whoever was watching decided to make sure she never got the chance. Chapter 8, The Long Way Down. Rossweiss did not sleep that night. Instead, she spent the hours before dawn doing the one thing she still had any control over, which was preparing. She copied the document, twice, encoding both copies inside spell matrices disguised as old training notes, the kind of dense, boring magical theory that no one would bother examining closely. One copy she hid inside her own personal effects. The other, after a long moment of hesitation, she slipped into Rias's study, tucked inside a book on devil family law that she knew, from years of working alongside her, Rias had been meaning to read for months and had not yet started. If something happened to her, at least the truth would not disappear with her. Then she sat at her desk, the surveillance rune still glowing faintly, and forced herself to think clearly about what she actually knew. The dimensional gap was, by every law of magic Rossweiss understood, unreachable except by beings of extraordinary power, and even then, only briefly, and only at enormous risk. The gap unraveled matter, unraveled magic, unraveled the very concepts that held a person together. No spell she knew of could open a stable pathway into it, and back out again. But Rossweiss was not just any magic user. She had spent centuries in Odin's service, and among the techniques she had learned, rarely used and considered largely obsolete, was a category of rune magic specifically designed for traversing spaces that should not, by ordinary logic, be traversable. Pathways between Yggdrasil's roots. Bridges across the void between realms. The Old Norse cosmology had never been shy about the existence of places that existed outside conventional reality, and its magic, unlike most modern devil magic, had been built with those places in mind. It would not be safe. It might not even work. But it was the only option she had. The first light of dawn was beginning to filter through her window when the surveillance rune on her desk flared, suddenly and violently, from a faint glow to a blinding pulse of red light, and Rossweiss felt, with absolute certainty, the unmistakable sensation of a powerful scrying spell snapping shut around her, like a hand closing around a moth. They knew. Whatever window of time she had thought she had, it had just run out. Rosweiss moved. She grabbed the small bag she had packed hours ago, containing nothing but a handful of essential runestones and a change of clothes, and activated, with shaking hands, the largest and most dangerous rune sequence she had ever attempted, a pathway technique she had only ever practiced in controlled, supervised conditions, designed to open a temporary bridge to the spaces between realities. The floor of her office dissolved into a swirling sigil of pale blue light, and from somewhere outside her door, she heard voices, raised, urgent, footsteps moving quickly down the hall toward her room. Rosweiss? Aquino's voice again, no longer casual, sharp with alarm. Rosweiss, open this door right now, we're detecting a massive surge of... The sigil beneath Rosweiss' feet completed itself, and the floor, the walls, the entire familiar shape of her office, fell away. For a moment, there was only falling, and the strange, vertiginous sensation of moving simultaneously in every direction and none at all, the unique horror of a space that did not obey the rules of up or down, here or there. The bridge held for exactly as long as Rosweiss had feared it might, which was to say, not nearly long enough. She felt it begin to fray almost immediately, the ancient Norse runes straining against forces they had never been designed to withstand, the boundary between the bridge and the raw, unraveling nothingness of the dimensional gap growing thinner with every passing second. She was not falling into the gap so much as the gap was reaching toward her, patient and infinite, waiting for the moment her protections finally gave out. Rosweiss poured everything she had left into holding the bridge together, every spell, every reserve of magical energy, every scrap of training from centuries of service, and it was, she knew with growing certainty, not going to be enough. The bridge was failing faster than she could reinforce it. In moments, it would collapse entirely, and she would be cast directly into the gap with no protection at all, the same fate the Council had engineered for Issei months ago, except this time, there would be no ancient dragon soul to shield her from what came next. Far below her, or beside her, or in whatever direction the gap's broken geometry considered down, something vast and amber-colored pulsed faintly in the endless black, and Rosweiss, in the last clear moment before her bridge gave out entirely, found herself thinking, with strange and sudden clarity, that whatever that light was, it was the first thing in this entire featureless void that looked like it had been built on purpose. The bridge shattered. Rosweiss fell, the gap silent, hungry nothing closing around her from every side at once, and she had just enough time to think, with a calm that surprised even her, that at least the truth was safe, even if she wasn't, before the world dissolved entirely into black. And then, impossibly, she felt something catch her. Not a spell. Not a rune. A hand, solid and warm and unmistakably real, closing around her wrist with absolute certainty, and a voice, familiar in a way that made her chest ache with sudden, overwhelming relief, speaking directly into the silence around her. "I've got you," Issei said. "I've got you, Rosweiss. You're safe. I promise you're safe." The unraveling, frayed edges of the gap around her stilled instantly, the way they always did when Issei's presence touched them, and Rosweiss, for the first time since the surveillance rune had flared on her desk, allowed herself to breathe. "Issei," she said, her voice cracking with relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "You're alive. You're really alive. I found the file, Issei. I know what they did to you, I know why, and they know I know, they were watching me, they're going to." "Hey," Issei said gently, his other hand coming up to steady her properly, his expression, even in the featureless black of the gap, radiating a kind of fierce warmth that Rosweiss had not realized, until this exact moment, just how badly she had needed to see. "Breathe. You're here now. Whatever they were planning to do, they can't reach you here. Nobody can." "You don't understand," Rosweiss said, still shaking. "The document, the addendum, it said you might be adapting, it said the factions were reassessing containment. Issei, they're afraid of you, all three of them, and if they're afraid enough, they might not stop at just exile next time, they might." "Rosweiss," Issei said, his voice steady and calm in a way that, more than anything else, finally let her own breathing begin to slow. "Let's get you somewhere warm first. And then you can tell me everything. All of it. And I promise, whatever they're planning, we'll figure it out together." He guided her gently through the dark, toward the distant amber glow that Roswise had glimpsed in the last moments before her bridge collapsed, and as they drew closer, she found herself staring, open-mouthed, at the sheer scale of what stood before her. Towers of pale crystal, soaring impossibly tall, glowing softly from within with light that came from nowhere she could identify. Wings of the structure stretching out in every direction, far larger than any building she had ever seen, and somehow, despite its size, radiating nothing but warmth. "Issei," she said slowly, "what is this place?" "It's home," Issei said simply. "Or, it's becoming one anyway. Come on. There's some people here you'll want to meet. And honestly, after what you just told me, I think we all need to have a very serious conversation about exactly how scared those factions actually are, and what that's going to mean for the rest of us." Behind them, in the world above, in an office with a shattered floor and a still glowing surveillance rune, Aquino and Rias stood staring at the spot where Roswise had vanished, and on Rias's desk, tucked inside a half-open book on Devil Family Law, a hidden document waited to be found. Chapter 9: The Weight of the Truth. By the time Roswise had finished telling the full story, twice, the violet light of the courtyard had dimmed into something approaching night, though Issei suspected that, like everything else in the Forbidden Palace, the lighting was simply responding to the mood of the room rather than any actual passage of time. Grafiya had listened to the entire account without a single interruption, her expression growing more still and more focused with every detail, the way Issei imagined a general's expression might look while receiving a battle report. Serafall had listened with her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, her usual warmth replaced by something colder and sharper that Issei had not seen from her before, an expression that reminded him, uncomfortably, of exactly how dangerous a Satan could be when something they cared about was threatened. "So," Serafall said, when Roswise finally finished, "to summarize. The biblical factions, all three of them, working together, in secret, deliberately fabricated treason charges against Issei Kun in order to dispose of him without taking responsibility for the disposal. And now that he has survived, and is, according to their own surveillance, actively adapting and growing stronger, they are reassessing how to handle the situation." "That's the short version, yes," Roswise said. She was wrapped in a thick blanket that Grafiya had produced from somewhere, and despite everything, Issei thought she looked better than she had when he pulled her out of the gap, the deep exhaustion in her eyes replaced by something more focused now that the immediate danger had passed. "And they were watching you," Grafiya said. "Closely enough to detect the moment you accessed the file, and to begin surveillance within hours. The rune on my desk had been active for hours before I noticed it," Roswise confirmed. "By the time I realized, it was already too late to do anything but run." "Then they know you ran," Grafiya said. "Which means, within hours, possibly already, the Council will know that someone discovered the truth about Issei's exile, attempted to flee using forbidden travel magic, and vanished, presumably into the gap, presumably to her death." "They'll think I'm dead," Roswise said slowly. "They will hope you are dead," Grafiya corrected. "Which is, in some ways, useful. As far as the Underworld's official records are concerned, you have suffered the same fate they engineered for Issei. Nobody will be looking for you, specifically, because nobody believes there is anything left to find." "But the document," Roswise said. "I left a copy in Rias's study, hidden inside a book. If they search her quarters—" "They won't," Grafiya said, with the calm certainty of someone who understood exactly how the Underworld's political machinery operated. Searching the private quarters of a sitting head of a major devil household, without cause, would itself be a significant political act, one that would draw exactly the kind of attention the factions responsible for this are desperate to avoid. As long as Rias does not give them a reason to suspect she has something worth finding, your copy is safe, for now." "For now," Issei repeated. "What happens when she finds it?" The room went quiet for a moment. "That," Grafiya said carefully, "depends entirely on what Rias decides to do with it. And Issei, I want to be honest with you about something, because I think you deserve honesty more than comfort, right now." Issei braced himself. "Rias loves you," Grafiya said. "I have known her since she was a child, and I have never seen her care for anyone the way she cares for you. But Rias is also, whether she likes it or not, the head of one of the most prominent devil households in the underworld, and the political position she occupies is, at this exact moment, extraordinarily precarious. If she learns the truth, and if she reacts to it the way her heart will want her to react, by demanding answers, by confronting the council, by trying to expose what was done to you, she will be putting not just herself at risk, but everyone in her peerage. Everyone who depends on the Gremory household's continued stability. So what? She just has to pretend none of this happened. Issei said, and he heard, with some surprise, real anger in his own voice. She just has to keep working for the same people who threw me away like garbage and tried to do the same thing to you and Serafall? I am not saying that is what she should do, Grafiya said gently. I am saying that is the impossible choice she will be facing, the moment she finds that document, and I think you should be prepared for the possibility that, for a while at least, the only thing Rias may be able to safely do with the truth is sit with it, quietly, while she works out how, or whether, she can act on it without destroying everything she has spent years trying to protect. Issei was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands, at the gauntlet that had, somehow, against every expectation, become the reason 4 people were now sitting in a palace built from nothing, hiding from a world that had decided all of them were too dangerous, or too inconvenient, to be allowed to exist as they were. I don't want her to be in danger because of me, he said finally. I don't want anyone to be in danger because of me. That's the whole point of this place. Somewhere nobody has to be afraid anymore. And that, the Void Dragon Emperor said, its voice resonating through the room with a weight Issei had not heard from it before, is precisely why, Issei Hyodo, this place can no longer simply be a sanctuary. Not if the factions that did this to you are now afraid enough to consider further action. A sanctuary that cannot also defend the people connected to it, even from a distance, is not enough. Not anymore. What are you saying? Issei asked. I am saying, the Void Dragon Emperor said, that it is time you learned what concept erasure was truly feared for. Not as a weapon to be used carelessly, but as a deterrent. The 3 biblical factions fabricated charges, exiled you, and attempted to engineer your death, all to avoid the political consequences of openly moving against the sacred gear host. They are afraid of exposure. Afraid of accountability. Afraid of precisely the kind of truth that Rosweiss risked everything to bring you. The amber light of the room seemed to deepen, very slightly, taking on the faint violet edge that Issei had come to associate with the Void Dragon Emperor's deepest, oldest power. What if, the ancient voice continued, they understood that the truth Rosweiss carries is no longer something that can simply be buried? What if they understood that any further action against you, against the people in this palace, or against anyone connected to the people in this palace, would result in that truth becoming impossible to erase, no matter how many factions cooperated to try? Grafia's eyes had narrowed thoughtfully, the focused look of someone already several steps ahead. You're suggesting we make the truth itself the deterrent, she said slowly. Not a threat of force. A guarantee of consequences. If they move against any of us, or against anyone connected to us, the full record of what was done to Issei becomes public, across all 3 factions, simultaneously, in a way that cannot be contained or denied. Precisely, the Void Dragon Emperor said. And Issei now has, within this palace, 3 of the most knowledgeable individuals in the underworld regarding exactly how such information could be most effectively, and most permanently, distributed, the moment it became necessary. Serafall set down her cup, and for the first time since Rosweiss had arrived, she smiled, and it was not her usual bright, theatrical smile. It was sharper. Colder. The smile, Issei thought, of someone who had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who had just made a very serious mistake. Issei-kun, she said, I believe I am about to enjoy this far more than I probably should. Outside the palace walls, in the vast black emptiness of the gap, the faint resonance signature that the faction's surveillance had been tracking for weeks pulsed once, steadily, and then, for the briefest moment, flared violet and gold in a pattern that, had anyone above been monitoring closely enough to notice, would have looked very much like the signature of something settling, finally, into the shape of a decision. Chapter 10. The letter no one could trace. 3 days passed within the palace, 3 days that Rosweiss spent mostly resting, eating a Kino's tea recreated from Issei's memory, and slowly, carefully, beginning to relax into a place that, despite everything, felt safer than anywhere she had been in months. It was Grafiya who finally raised the question that had been sitting, unspoken, at the center of everything since Roswei's arrival. "We need to decide how to use what we know," she said, on the third evening, as the four of them sat once again around the long table in the central room. "And more importantly, we need to decide how to communicate it, in a way that protects everyone involved, including Rias. You said searching her quarters would be too politically risky for them," Issei said. "But what if she finds the document on her own? What if she reads it and doesn't know what to do, and they find out she knows before we've even had a chance to set anything up?" "That," Grafiya said, "is precisely the risk we need to address. Which is why I believe the most important thing we can do, right now, is make sure that when Rias finds that document, and Issei, I do believe she will find it, given enough time, she finds it alongside something else. A way to act on it that does not require her to act alone, or visibly, or in a way that exposes her to the consequences Grafiya described." "What kind of something else?" Issei asked. "A letter," Grafiya said. "Not from Issei. From all of us. Explaining what we know, what we have, and most importantly, what we intend to do with it, if necessary. Something that makes it clear to Rias that she does not need to act. That the people who have already been wronged are prepared to act on their own behalf, and that all Rias needs to do, for now, is exactly what she has already been doing. Nothing visibly different. Nothing that draws attention." "How do we even get a letter to her?" Rosweiss asked. "Any kind of magical transmission strong enough to cross the boundary into the gap would be detected instantly. The same surveillance that caught me would catch that too." "Not if it never crosses the boundary as a transmission," Serafall said, and there was something thoughtful in her expression now, the sharp, focused look of a strategist working through a problem she found, despite its stakes, genuinely interesting. "Issei-kun, you said that things in this palace become real because you understand them clearly enough. Concept Erasure's counterpart. Genesis." "Right," Issei said slowly, not yet sure where this was going. "What if," Serafall said, "instead of sending something across the boundary, you simply made something exist, on the other side of it, that was already there? Not a transmission. A placement. The same book Rosweiss hid her copy inside already exists in Rias's study. What if you simply ensured that, the next time Rias opened that book, there was a second item inside it that had not been there before, placed there not by crossing the boundary, but by you defining, with enough clarity, that it had always been there?" The room was quiet for a moment as everyone considered this. "That's," Issei started, then stopped. "Is that even possible?" "That sounds like it shouldn't be possible." "Genesis and Erasure," the Void Dragon Emperor said, its voice carrying the faint note of approval Issei had come to recognize. "Two sides of the same coin. You have spent months learning to define things into existence within this palace, where the boundaries of reality are, shall we say, more flexible than they are in the world above. But the boundary between this place and the world above is not a wall, Issei. It is a membrane, permeable in both directions, provided what passes through it is something the world above can accept as having always been true. A letter that has always been inside that book is a much smaller change to the fabric of reality than a letter that suddenly appears from nowhere." "Okay," Issei said, "but I've never tried anything like this before. What if I get it wrong? What if instead of a letter, Rias opens that book and finds, I don't know, a rock or nothing, or it just doesn't work at all?" "Then we try again," Grafiya said simply. "But Issei, I have watched you build an entire palace, room by room, out of nothing but understanding and intent. I do not believe a single letter, written with as much care and clarity as you are capable of, is beyond you." Issei looked around the table, at Grafiya's calm certainty, at Serafall's sharp focus, at Rosweiss, still wrapped in her blanket, watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and exhaustion. "All right," he said. "Let's write it together. All of us. So it's clear, and so it's true, in every way that matters." It took the better part of a day to get the letter right. Grafiya insisted on precise, careful language, the kind that could not be misread or used against Rias if it were ever somehow intercepted. Serafall added details about the political landscape, specific names and positions that Rias would need to understand in order to know exactly how dangerous, and how useful, the information she now possessed truly was. Rausweiss, with quiet determination, insisted on including a full, unredacted account of what the document had actually said, because, as she put it, Rias deserved the truth in full, not a softened version of it. And Issei wrote the final section himself, the part that mattered most to him, in his own words, without anyone else's input. Rias. I'm alive. I'm safe, safer than I've ever been, actually. I built somewhere, with some help, and there are people here who need it somewhere safe too, and I think, by the time you read this, you'll understand a little bit about why. I know what they did to me wasn't an accident, and I know you probably feel like you should have known, should have been there, should have done something. But Rias, none of this is your fault, and I need you to hear that, clearly, because I know you, and I know you're probably going to try to carry this like it is. You don't have to do anything right now. You don't have to fix this, or confront anyone, or put yourself or anyone in your peerage at risk. The people here with me, and I think you'll be surprised by who some of them are, have this handled. All I need from you, for now, is to keep being exactly who you are, where you are, because that matters more than you know. I miss you. I miss all of you. And someday, when it's safe, I hope you'll get to see this place. I think you'd like it. Until then, please be careful. And please, whatever you do, don't try to find a way to reach me. Not yet. Let us handle this first. With everything. Issei. When it was finished, Issei held the completed letter in his hands, closed his eyes, and pictured, with as much care and detail as he had ever pictured anything, a specific book on a specific shelf in a specific study, a book on devil family law that Rias had been meaning to read for months, and a letter, folded neatly, tucked between its pages, exactly where it had, in this newly defined version of reality, always been. He felt something shift, somewhere far away, a small and quiet click, like a key turning in a lock that had always been meant for it. It's done, Issei said, opening his eyes. I think. I hope. We will know soon enough, Grafiya said. And Issei, regardless of what happens next, I want you to know that what you just did, the letter, the care you put into it, the fact that your first instinct, even now, even after everything that has been done to you, was to make sure Rias did not blame herself, that tells me something important about you. Something that, I suspect, is going to matter a great deal, the more people find their way to this palace. Far above, in a quiet study in the Grafiya estate, on a shelf that had not been touched in days, a book on devil family law sat exactly where it had been left, and inside it, tucked between two pages near the middle, something that had not been there that morning waited, patiently, for someone to come looking for it. Chapter 11, The Book on the Shelf. Rias Gremory had not slept properly since Rausweiss disappeared. It had been 4 days since the surge of pale blue light had torn through her tutor's office, 4 days since Aquino had broken down the locked door to find nothing but a scorched circle on the floor and a still glowing surveillance room that, when Aquino tried to examine it, had simply gone dark, as if whoever had placed it no longer cared whether anyone found it. The council's official response had been swift, and infuriatingly thin. An unfortunate accident. An unauthorized and unstable use of forbidden travel magic, resulting, almost certainly, in the loss of the practitioner within the dimensional gap. A tragedy, the council's statement had called it, and a reminder of the dangers of dabbling in old, dangerous magics best left forgotten. Rias did not believe a word of it. She had known Rausweiss for years. Rausweiss was careful, methodical, the last person in the world who would attempt something as reckless as an unsupervised jump into forbidden travel magic without an overwhelming reason. And the timing, less than a week after Issei's exile, after a tribunal Rias had not even been informed was occurring until it was already over, gnawed at her in a way she could not put into words, even to Aquino, even to herself. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for weeks, and every time Rias tried to pull at the thread, she found official channels closing, polite non-answers multiplying, and a growing, uneasy sense that the world she had grown up in, the world of devil politics and faction alliances she had spent her entire life learning to navigate, had quietly become something she no longer recognized. It was late, well past midnight, when Rias finally gave up on sleep entirely and made her way to her study, intending to lose herself and work until exhaustion finally won out. Her eyes fell, almost without meaning to, on the small stack of books on her shelf that she had been meaning to read for months and never quite found the time for. A book on devil family law sat near the top of the stack, its spine slightly worn, and Rias found herself reaching for it without really thinking about why, the way a person sometimes reaches for the most boring possible task as a form of self-soothing, the comfort of something dry and procedural after weeks of fear and uncertainty. She opened it at random, somewhere near the middle, and a folded piece of paper slipped out from between the pages and fell, fluttering, to the floor. Rias stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. The book had been on that shelf for months. She had never opened it before tonight. There was no reason for anything to be tucked inside it. She unfolded the paper, and the moment she saw the handwriting at the bottom, her breath caught so hard it hurt. Issei's handwriting. She knew it instantly, the slightly uneven loops, the way he always pressed too hard on certain letters, a habit he'd never quite grown out of from years of writing with claws he didn't have yet learned to fully retract. Rias read the letter once, quickly, her hands shaking. Then she read it again, slower, and by the third reading, she was sitting on the floor of her study, the book forgotten beside her, tears streaming silently down her face, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something she had not let herself feel since the day she came home to find Issei simply, impossibly, gone. Relief. Overwhelming, body-shaking relief. He was alive. He was safe. And somewhere, in a place she could not yet go, people she cared about, people who had also disappeared, also been quietly erased from the world's official record, were together, and safe, and beginning, it seemed, to do something about all of it. Rias read the letter a third time, then a fourth, committing every word to memory, and when she finally set it down, her tears had stopped, replaced by something steadier. Something that, had anyone seen her expression in that moment, they might have recognized as the look of someone who had just been handed, after weeks of helpless fear, the one thing she had needed most: a reason to wait. And the certainty that waiting was not the same as giving up. She read the section about Rosweiss, about the document, about what the three factions had truly done, and felt something cold and furious settle beneath the relief, a feeling she recognized, distantly, as the same feeling Issei himself must have felt, standing in that hall, listening to a tribunal explain away his life in clinical, bureaucratic language. But Issei had asked her not to do anything. Not yet. To keep being exactly who she was, where she was, because, as he put it, that mattered more than she knew. Rias folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the inner pocket of her robe, against her chest, and made a decision. She would wait. She would keep doing exactly what she had always done, managing her peerage, attending council functions, maintaining every appearance of a young devil-head quietly grieving the loss of a member of her household and slowly moving forward, exactly as the factions responsible for all of this would expect. But she would also watch. Carefully. Patiently. For any sign, any opportunity, any moment where the careful, controlled chess game the people in that palace were apparently now playing might need an additional piece on the board, someone positioned exactly where she was, with access exactly where she had it, ready to act the instant it became useful. Issei had told her not to try to reach him. He had not told her not to be ready. Rias stood, smoothed down her robe, and for the first time in 4 days, allowed herself a small, fierce smile. "All right, Issei," she murmured, to a study that was once again empty, to a letter pressed against her heart. "I'll wait. But I'm not going to just sit here and do nothing either. You've got people watching your back down there. Let me watch it from up here." Outside her window, the night sky over the Grafiya estate was clear and full of stars, and somewhere far beyond it, in a place no map could reach, a palace of amber crystal glowed steadily against the endless black, one room larger than it had been the night before, as if it, too, had felt the small, quiet click of a promise being made. Chapter 12, the next name on the list. A week after the letter found its way into Rias's hands, the Forbidden Palace had grown enough that Issei sometimes found himself losing track of which wing he was in, until Grafiya, with characteristic efficiency, produced a hand-drawn map that Serafall promptly decorated with small, cheerful illustrations of each room's purpose. An addition that Grafiya accepted with the long-suffering patience of someone who had clearly worked alongside Serafall for a very long time. Roswise had recovered enough to begin helping in earnest, and her contribution turned out to be exactly the one the group needed most. Years of careful, methodical research had given her an instinct for patterns that the others, for all their political experience, had never quite developed, and within days of settling in, she had begun cross-referencing everything she knew about the document's addendums against publicly available underworld records, looking for any sign of what the factions might be planning next. Here, she said, one evening, spreading a series of hand-copied documents across the long table. Look at the pattern. Grafia's removal from her position. Serafall's resignation. My own disappearance, which the Council is treating as confirmed. Each of these happened within days of a specific kind of event, a moment where someone in a position of significant independent power did something that drew unwanted attention from the reinstated old Satan faction, or their allies among the biblical factions. Someone draws attention, Issei said slowly, and then, within days, something happens to remove them. Precisely, Roswise said. And I think I've found the next name. She slid a final document across the table, a routine personnel transfer notice, the kind of thing that would normally attract no attention at all, except for the name listed and the destination. Zenobia Corda, Grafiya read aloud. Transferred, effective immediately, from active field duty under the Gremery Household's affiliated Exorcist Division, to a, quote, administrative reassignment within the Vatican's Records Office, pending review of conduct during the Sacred Gear Disposition Incident. They're calling my exile the Sacred Gear Disposition Incident, Issei said, an edge creeping into his voice that he didn't bother to hide. Issei, Roswise said gently, Zenobia was part of the unit that responded when the magic circle activated during your tribunal. According to this, she filed an official objection afterward, formally on the record, stating that the exile sentence had been carried out with what she described as, and I'm quoting directly, irregular procedural haste inconsistent with established protocols for cases of this severity. She spoke up, Issei said. She actually spoke up, and now they're reassigning her to an administrative records office, Grafiya finished, located, according to this transfer notice, in a Vatican facility currently scheduled for what the document describes as routine structural decommissioning, 3 days from now. The room went very quiet. They're going to make it look like an accident, Serafall said, her earlier sharpness returning in full force. A building collapsed during decommissioning. A tragic loss of an exorcist who, conveniently, had recently raised uncomfortable questions about Issei Kun's exile. We have 3 days, Roswise said. Then we have 3 days to get her out before it happens, Issei said, standing up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the crystal floor. Roswise, do you know exactly where this facility is? Can you map it? I can, Roswise said, already pulling out fresh parchment, but Issei, getting into a Vatican facility, even an old decommissioned one, isn't like reaching into the gap. There are wards, blessed ground, defenses specifically designed to keep beings like you out. Then we don't go in like a devil, Issei said. The Void Dragon Emperor's power isn't a devil's power, or an angel's, or anything else those wards were built to recognize. It's older than all of it. Older than the concepts those wards are even built around. He's right, the Void Dragon Emperor said, its voice resonating through the room with quiet certainty. Wards are built to recognize and exclude specific categories of being, devil, fallen, dragon, and so on. They were never built to exclude something that predates the categories themselves. To those wards, Issei and I together will not register as a threat to be repelled. We will simply not register at all. That's Grafiya paused, processing this. That's an extraordinary advantage. But Issei, even if you can enter undetected, extracting Zenobia safely, without anyone realizing she's gone before the collapse is meant to occur, will require precise timing. If her absence is noticed even slightly too early, the factions responsible may simply accelerate their plans, or worse, target someone else in her unit to cover for the discrepancy. Then we make sure nobody notices, Issei said. Roswise, can you map out exactly where Zenobia is likely to be, hour by hour, for the next 3 days? I can build a reasonable model based on standard administrative schedules, Rossweiss said, already sketching. But Issei, there's something else you should know. I recognize this transfer order's authorization signature. It's the same signature that appears on the original addendum recommending your exile. Whoever is doing this, they're not just removing inconvenient people one at a time. They're using the exact same bureaucratic playbook, over and over, confident that nobody will ever connect the pattern, because each individual case looks, on paper, completely unremarkable. Then maybe it's time somebody connected the pattern, Issei said quietly. 3 days. Let's get to work. Over the following 2 days, the palace's central room became something closer to a war room than Issei had ever imagined it could be. Rossweiss' careful research combined with Grafiya's intimate knowledge of bureaucratic procedure and Serafall's political instincts produced, by the end of the second day, a plan that Issei found himself both impressed by and slightly unnerved by, given how casually the 3 women discussed the logistics of infiltrating a heavily warded religious facility. The decommissioning crew arrives at dawn on the 3rd day, Grafiya explained, tracing a finger across Rossweiss' hand-drawn map. Zenovia's administrative duties, according to the schedule Rossweiss modeled, place her in the records archive on the building's lower level during the early morning hours, completing final inventory before the crew begins work. This is almost certainly not a coincidence. The lower level archive is the section of the building structurally weakest, and most likely to be where the, quote, accident occurs. So we get there before dawn, Issei said. Before the crew arrives, before anything happens. Get to Zenovia, get her out, and make sure it looks like she was never there to begin with. Precisely, Grafiya said. And Issei, there is one more thing you should consider. Zenovia does not know any of us. She does not know what truly happened during your exile, beyond what she witnessed and objected to. When you appear in front of her, in a Vatican facility, having apparently emerged from nowhere, she is, in all likelihood, going to be very confused, possibly hostile, and almost certainly going to ask a great many questions you may not have time to fully answer before you need to leave. Then I guess, Issei said, with a faint, determined smile, I'd better be ready to explain things pretty quickly. That night, as the others finalized the last details of the plan, Issei stood alone in the training hall, running through the techniques the Void Dragon Emperor had been teaching him, the careful, deliberate practice of moving through space the way the gap itself moved, present everywhere and nowhere until the moment a decision was made. Are you ready for this? The Void Dragon Emperor asked quietly. I think so, Issei said. It's strange. A few months ago, I was the one who needed saving. Now I'm the one trying to save someone else before something terrible happens to them. Is that strange to you? The Void Dragon Emperor asked, and there was something gentle in its tone. Or does it feel, perhaps, like exactly what this place was always meant to become? Issei thought about that, about the amber halls and violet gardens, about Grafiya's quiet efficiency and Serafall's sharp humor and Rossweiss' careful, determined research, about a letter tucked inside a book on a shelf far above them, and about a young exorcist, 3 days from now, about to walk into a building that had already been condemned, in more ways than one, without ever knowing it. No, Issei said finally. It feels exactly right. Chapter 13. The Archive Before Dawn. The Vatican facility, when Issei stepped through into it, did not look like the kind of place anyone would willingly walk into to die. It looked tired. Old stone corridors lined with shelves of records that had not been updated in decades, dust thick on surfaces, the air carrying the particular still quiet of a building that everyone involved had already mentally written off. Issei understood, walking through it, why nobody would think twice about an accident here. Nothing about this place suggested anything worth protecting. That, he thought grimly, was probably exactly the point. The lower archive is 2 levels down, the Void Dragon Emperor said quietly. I can feel the wards around this place, Issei. They are old, and they are extensive, and they have not so much as flickered since we arrived. As predicted, we are simply not a category of thing they were built to notice. Issei moved through the corridors quickly but carefully, following the route Rossweiss had mapped, down a narrow stone stairwell, through a heavy door that had been left slightly ajar, and into a long, low-ceilinged room lined floor to ceiling with shelves of aging documents. A young woman with short blue hair stood near the far end of the room, methodically checking items off a list, a sword resting against the shelf beside her, the posture of someone doing a tedious job efficiently because that was simply how she did everything. Zenobia Corda looked up the moment Issei stepped fully into the room, and her hand was on the hilt of her sword before he had even finished speaking. "Who are you?" she said, not a question so much as a demand, "and how did you get past the perimeter wards?" "Nothing gets past those wards. My name's Issei," Issei said, raising both hands slowly, palms open, the universal gesture of someone trying very hard not to look like a threat. "Issei Hyodo. I used to be part of the Gremory household's peerage. I think you might have heard of me, actually, for kind of a terrible reason." Zenovia's eyes narrowed, the sword half drawn now, but something in her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition. "Hyodo," she repeated slowly. "The Sacred Gear host. The one who was exiled for treason. You're supposed to be dead." "I am, officially," Issei said. "Which is actually kind of the problem, and also kind of why I'm here. Zenobia, I don't have a lot of time to explain everything, but I need you to listen, because in about 3 hours, this entire building is going to collapse during a, quote, routine decommissioning, and you're going to be in this room when it happens. This building has been scheduled for decommissioning for weeks," Zenobia said, though her grip on the sword had loosened slightly. "It's old. Structurally unsound. The collapse won't be a surprise to anyone." "It won't be a surprise," Issei agreed, "because it's not an accident. Zenobia, do you remember filing an official objection, after my tribunal, about how the exile sentence was carried out?" Zenovia's expression changed completely. "How do you know about that?" she said slowly. "That objection was filed through internal channels. It wasn't public record. It is to the people who are afraid of what's in it," Issei said. "Zenobia, the same factions that fabricated treason charges to exile me have been quietly removing anyone who's raised uncomfortable questions about what happened. Grafiya Lucifuge. Serafall Leviathan. Rosweiss, from Rias's household, who disappeared a week ago and is officially presumed dead. And now you. This transfer, this building, the timing of the decommissioning. It's not a coincidence. It's the same pattern, over and over, and they're very good at making each individual case look completely unremarkable." Zenobia stared at him for a long moment, and Issei could see her mind working, fitting pieces together, the careful methodical thinking of someone trained to assess threats and evidence quickly. "If what you're saying is true," she said slowly, "then I have approximately 3 hours before this building, with me in it, comes down, and it will be recorded as a tragic accident, and nobody will ever connect it to the objection I filed." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Issei said. "And I'm here because I'd really like that not to happen." "And you got past wards that nothing gets past," Zenobia said, "which means either you're lying about who you are, or everything I've heard about your sacred gear being something other than what everyone thought it was, is true." "It's true," Issei said simply. "All of it. I'll explain everything, I promise, but Zenobia, we really don't have a lot of time. There's a place, somewhere safe, where the people I mentioned are already staying. I can take you there right now. Nobody will be able to reach you, and more importantly, when this building comes down in 3 hours and you're not in it, the people responsible are going to have a very confusing morning trying to figure out what happened." Zenobia looked down at the sword in her hand, then at the shelves around her, decades of records that had been quietly forgotten, in a building that had been quietly condemned, in a system that had quietly decided her life was an acceptable cost for maintaining a secret. "My partner," she said suddenly. "Irina. She doesn't know about any of this, the objection, the transfer, none of it. If I just vanish, the same way Rosweiss vanished, she's going to think the worst, and she's going to start asking questions, the exact kind of questions that got me reassigned in the first place." Issei hesitated. He hadn't planned for this. "Could she be in danger too?" he asked. "If she starts asking questions?" "Almost certainly," Zenobia said grimly. "Irina doesn't know how to let something go once she's decided it matters. If I disappear and she starts pulling at this thread the way I did, she's going to end up exactly where I am now. Maybe faster." Issei thought about Grafia's careful planning, about Rosweiss' letter tucked inside a book, about the importance of leaving things in a way that protected the people left behind rather than simply removing the danger from one person at a time. Then we don't just get you out, Issei said slowly, an idea forming. We make sure that when you disappear, it looks like exactly the kind of accident they were already planning, except this time, the story it tells points the finger right back at them, in a way Irina can follow without ever having to take a single risk herself. What do you mean? Rosweiss left a letter, Issei said. Somewhere it would be found, eventually, by someone who needed to find it, without anyone watching being able to trace how it got there. What if we did the same thing here? A message somewhere Irina would find it, that doesn't put her in danger by telling her too much directly, but gives her exactly enough to start protecting herself, and maybe, eventually, to find her own way to the same place you're about to go. Zenobia studied him for a long moment, then, slowly, sheathed her sword. You're not what I expected, she said. Everyone talks about the boosted gears host like he's some kind of monster they're all terrified of. You're standing here worried about my partner's safety 3 hours before a building is supposed to fall on you. I get that a lot, apparently, Issei said, with a faint, tired smile. Come on. Let's get this written, and get you out of here, and then I'll explain literally everything else once we're somewhere that isn't about to fall down. It took less than 20 minutes to write the message, short, careful, designed to be found rather than delivered, tucked into Zenovia's own personal effects in a way that would seem, to anyone investigating, like something she had simply forgotten to take with her. And then, with the same quiet certainty he had used to pull Rosweiss from the collapsing bridge between worlds, Issei reached out, took Zenovia's hand, and stepped both of them sideways out of a building that, 3 hours later, would collapse exactly as scheduled, with no one inside it at all, leaving behind nothing but confused investigators, an unexplained discrepancy in the morning roll call, and, tucked carefully where she would be sure to find it, a single message that would, in time, change the course of one more life entirely. Chapter 14. A New Face at the Table. Zenovia's first reaction to the Forbidden Palace was, in Issei's opinion, the most refreshingly normal response anyone had given so far. This is absurd, she said flatly, standing in the entrance hall, looking up at the soaring crystal ceiling with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and grudging admiration. You built this. By yourself. Inside the dimensional gap. Out of nothing. With some help, Issei said, gesturing toward Grafiya and Serafall, who had come to meet them, and toward Rosweiss, who gave Zenobia a small, tired wave from where she sat curled in a chair nearby. Rosweiss, Zenobia said, and for the first time, real surprise broke through her composed exterior. You're alive. The official report said. I know what the official report said, Rosweiss said, with a faint, dry smile. I'm starting to think there's a pattern with these official reports. There is, Grafiya said, stepping forward and extending a hand toward Zenobia with the calm formality Issei had come to recognize as her default mode of operation, even now. Grafiya Lucifuge. I imagine you have questions, Miss Corda. Most of them, I suspect, are the same questions the rest of us had, when we first arrived. That's putting it mildly, Zenobia said, shaking Grafia's hand, then turning to look at Issei with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last few minutes, from suspicion to something more thoughtful. Issei. Before anything else. Irina. Is she safe? Did the message work? We won't know until it's found, Issei said. But Zenobia, I want you to understand something. Whatever happens with Irina, whatever she decides to do with what she finds, that's going to be her choice. We gave her information, not instructions. She's smart. She'll figure out what to do with it. Zenobia nodded slowly, though Issei could see the worry still sitting behind her eyes. You really don't know her, she said. Irina doesn't do things halfway. If she reads that message and understands even half of what it implies, she's not going to sit quietly and wait for someone else to act. Then maybe, Serafall said, with the sharp, thoughtful look she'd worn since Rosweiss's discovery of the document's pattern, we should make sure that whatever she decides to do, she has somewhere safe to land, the moment she decides to do it. 3 days later, in a small chapel on the outskirts of a Vatican administrative compound, a young woman with long brown hair sat alone, staring at a folded piece of paper that had been tucked, with deliberate care, inside her partner's spare uniform, the uniform Zenobia had left behind, along with everything else, the night the lower archive building had collapsed with no one inside it. Irina Shida had read the message 11 times. It did not say much, not directly. It described carefully, in language designed to inform without endangering, the existence of a pattern. Names. Dates. The quiet, bureaucratic removal of people who had asked uncomfortable questions, dressed up as transfers, resignations, accidents. It told her that Zenobia was alive, and safe, and that the same was true for several others whose deaths or disappearances had been quietly reported over the past 2 months. And it told her, gently but unmistakably, that if she ever found herself in a position where she, too, had asked one question too many, and felt the walls beginning to close in, there would be somewhere for her to go. A door that would open, when she needed it to, and not before. Irina folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest, the way Rias had held a similar letter, weeks ago and a world away, and for a long moment she simply sat with the strange, overwhelming mixture of grief and relief and fierce, protective anger that the message had stirred in her. Zenobia was alive. That was what mattered most. Everything else, the pattern, the names, the careful bureaucratic cruelty of it all, that could wait. For now. But Irina Shida had never been good at letting things wait. She thought about her current assignment, a routine liaison position between the Exorcist Corps and a Vatican Oversight Committee, the kind of quiet, unremarkable post that nobody paid much attention to. She thought about the access that position gave her, to records, to schedules, to the kind of routine administrative paperwork that, as it turned out, was exactly the kind of paperwork where patterns like the one described in this letter tended to hide. And she thought about a door somewhere that would open when she needed it to. Irina did not plan to need it. Not for a while, at least. But she found, reading the letter one final time before tucking it carefully into her own belongings, that knowing the door existed changed something in her, settled something. The way knowing an exit is available can make a person feel braver about staying in a room a little longer than they otherwise might. All right, she murmured to the empty chapel, echoing, without knowing it, words spoken weeks ago in a study far above the dimensional gap. I'll be careful. But I'm not just going to sit here and pretend I didn't see this. Back in the Forbidden Palace, Issei felt something shift, faint and far away, a small resonance that the Void Dragon Emperor identified, after a moment of quiet concentration, as the unmistakable signature of someone, somewhere, making a decision to start watching very carefully. She found it, Issei said. She found it. The Void Dragon Emperor agreed. And Issei, I think you should prepare yourself. Word travels quickly among people who have learned to recognize the same kind of fear in each other. Zenovia's disappearance, on the heels of Rosweiss, on the heels of Grafiya's removal and Serafall's resignation, is going to start looking, to anyone paying close enough attention, less like a series of unrelated incidents and more like exactly what it is. A pattern, Issei said. A pattern. The Void Dragon Emperor agreed that the factions responsible are increasingly desperate to either control, or silence, before more people start noticing it the way Rosweiss and now Irina have. You have built something remarkable here, Issei. A sanctuary? A council of people the system tried to discard, now working together against the very forces that discarded them. But sanctuaries, by their nature, tend to attract more attention the more effective they become. Issei looked around the central room, at Zenobia settling into a chair, already deep in conversation with Rosweiss about exorcist protocols and Vatican bureaucracy, at Grafiya quietly making notes, at Serafall watching the whole scene with the satisfied expression of someone who had found, after a long search, exactly the right pieces for a plan that was only just beginning to take shape. Good, Issei said quietly. Let them notice. Let them figure out exactly what's happening. Because the more they realize what this place actually is, the more they're going to realize exactly how much they have to lose, if they ever try what they did to me again. Far above, in 3 different faction headquarters spread across 3 very different parts of the world, 3 separate groups of increasingly nervous officials were, at that very moment, beginning to compare notes, and discovering, to their growing alarm, that the pattern Rosweiss had uncovered was not merely real, but accelerating, and that whatever, or whoever, was responsible for it, was clearly no longer simply trying to survive. It was beginning, very quietly, and very deliberately, to fight back. Chapter 15. The Three Factions Meet. In a chamber that officially did not exist, located beneath a cathedral that the public records listed as permanently closed for restoration, representatives of the three biblical factions sat together for the first emergency joint session in over a decade. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary gathering. A senior archangel, representing the forces of heaven, sat at one end of a long stone table, his expression carefully neutral in the way that Issei, had he been present, would have immediately recognized as the expression of someone trying very hard not to show how frightened they actually were. Across from him sat a cardinal of unusually high rank, representing the Vatican's interests, his fingers steepled in front of him, his eyes flicking repeatedly to a stack of documents that he clearly did not enjoy having to discuss. And between them, occupying the seat traditionally reserved for the Devil faction's liaison to such gatherings, sat Valserius Astaroth, the same chief magistrate who had presided over Issei's tribunal months ago, looking considerably less composed than he had that day. Let us be clear about the scope of the problem, the cardinal said, without preamble, sliding a folder across the table. In the span of 2 months we have lost, through what our respective records describe as a series of unrelated incidents, 4 individuals of significant standing. A devil queen of unparalleled reputation. A sitting Satan? A Valkyrie attached to a major devil household. And, as of 3 days ago, an exorcist whose recent objections to the Hyodo exile had already drawn internal attention. All 4 incidents, the Archangel added, his voice carefully measured, occurred under circumstances that, examined individually, appear entirely explicable. Accidents. Resignations. A reckless use of forbidden magic. But examined together, Valserius said heavily, they form a pattern that points, unmistakably, toward a single conclusion. Subject Zero is not merely surviving within the gap. It is actively reaching beyond it, and it is specifically targeting individuals connected to the original disposition decision. You make it sound like an act of war, the cardinal said. Because that is precisely what it appears to be, Valserius said. Cardinal, with respect, I do not believe you fully appreciate what we are dealing with. The original threat assessment, 2 centuries ago, classified Subject Zero's ability as conceptual erasure. The capacity to remove established realities from existence. We exiled Issei Hyodo specifically because we believed the gap would complete what our predecessors began. Instead, Subject Zero appears to have done something none of our models predicted. Which is, it has begun creating, Valserius said, and the words seemed to cost him something to say. Our surveillance teams have detected stable, persistent structures forming within the gap, structures that should not be able to exist, anchored to a resonance signature that, our analysts now confirm, no longer belongs to Subject Zero alone. It has merged, in some fashion we do not understand, with the host's own consciousness. And it is, it seems, using that merged consciousness to extract individuals our own organizations have deemed inconvenient, and shelter them somewhere we cannot reach. The chamber was silent for a long moment. You're describing a sanctuary, the Archangel said slowly. Built by an entity our predecessors believed to be an extinction-level threat, currently sheltering several of the most powerful and well-connected individuals our factions have collectively, and quietly, removed from their positions over the past several years. I am describing, Valserius said grimly, the single most dangerous intelligence failure in the history of our 3 factions' cooperation. We assumed an exile would result in destruction. Instead, we have apparently provided Subject Zero with both the motivation and, increasingly, the resources to become something considerably more organized, and considerably more informed about exactly how our removal operations have historically been conducted. What are our options? The Cardinal asked, his composure visibly fraying. Surely there is some method of containment, some way to seal the gap more thoroughly, to prevent further extractions. The gap cannot be sealed, Valserius said. It is not a location. It is the absence of location, the space between all spaces. Subject Zero's original power was tied directly to that absence. Any attempt to seal it would require a force capable of imposing structure on the fundamental nature of reality itself, and the only entity our records have ever associated with that kind of power is, with no small irony, Subject Zero itself. Then what do you propose? The Archangel asked. Because, Magistrate, I do not believe any of us came to this meeting with a workable solution, and the longer this continues, the more individuals we have already wronged are likely to find their way to wherever this sanctuary is, and the more they are likely to share, between them, exactly how much they collectively know about how our organizations operate. Velsarius was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the stone table, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an exhaustion that, had Issei been there to hear it, he might have recognized with an uncomfortable flicker of sympathy. I propose, Velsarius said slowly, that we consider the possibility that containment is no longer the correct objective. Subject Zero has, by every indication, restrained itself to extraction and protection. No attacks. No demands. No attempt, as far as our surveillance can determine, to expose what it knows, despite clearly possessing the means and the motive to do so. You're suggesting negotiation, the Cardinal said, his tone making clear exactly how unprecedented, and how distasteful, he found the idea. I am suggesting, Velsarius said, that an entity capable of doing what Subject Zero has done, and choosing, repeatedly, not to escalate beyond quiet extraction, may be an entity that can, perhaps, be reasoned with. And given the alternative, which is waiting, helplessly, for the day it decides quiet extraction is no longer sufficient, I believe reasoning with it is considerably preferable to the alternative. And if it refuses to negotiate? The Archangel asked. If it has no interest in anything our factions could offer? Velsarius looked down at the folder in front of him, at the names of 4 people his organizations had quietly discarded over the past several months, and at the growing list of questions, uncomfortable, dangerous questions, that each of those 4 people undoubtedly now had answers to. Then, he said quietly, I suppose we will simply have to hope that whatever Issei Hyodo has become, in the months since we threw him away, he remains, at his core, the kind of person our records describe him as having been before any of this began. Because, gentlemen, if our intelligence is accurate, and Subject Zero's power has indeed merged with his own consciousness rather than overwhelming it, then the character of the person at the center of this sanctuary may be the single most important variable in whether any of us survive what comes next. In the Forbidden Palace, far below the chamber where 3 frightened factions debated the fate of a war they had started without realizing it, Issei sat in the courtyard beneath the violet trees, listening as the Void Dragon Emperor relayed, in careful detail, everything it had overheard. They're scared, Issei said quietly, when the Emperor finished. They are terrified, the Void Dragon Emperor corrected. And Issei, terrified people, particularly terrified people who hold enormous institutional power, are dangerous in ways that calm, confident people are not. Velsarius's instinct toward negotiation is, I believe, genuine. But I would not assume his colleagues share it, or that even Velsarius himself will be able to convince the rest of his faction to follow that instinct, if a louder, more frightened voice within their own ranks proposes something more drastic instead. So what do? We continue exactly as we have been, the Void Dragon Emperor said. We protect those who need protecting. We grow stronger, carefully, deliberately. And Issei, I think perhaps, it may soon be time to consider something we have not yet discussed. A response. Not an attack. But a message, delivered directly, that makes unmistakably clear exactly what this place is, what it is not, and exactly what will happen if anyone, frightened or otherwise, decides that drastic measures are preferable to negotiation. Issei looked up at the painted stars overhead, at the soft violet glow of the blossoms around him, and thought about Grafiya, and Serafall, and Rosweiss, and Zenobia, each of them sitting somewhere in this palace right now, each of them safe, for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, because of a place that had begun, only months ago, as a single block of amber crystal floating alone in an endless black void. A message, he said slowly? Yeah. I think you're right. It's time. Chapter 16, The Message. They debated, for the better part of a day, exactly what form the message should take. Not a threat, Issei said firmly, more than once. I don't want this to be us telling them what we'll do if they don't behave. That's the same thing they did to all of us. Power over people, dressed up as policy. Then what would you call it? Serafall asked, not unkindly. Issei-kun, I understand the distinction you're drawing, and for what it's worth, I think it's the right one. But the factions responsible for what happened to all of us are, at this exact moment, frightened enough that they may do something far worse than what they have already done, simply because they don't yet understand that there's another option. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone caught in a panic is show them, clearly, exactly what their other options actually are. An offer, Grafiya said slowly, rather than an ultimatum. A demonstration of what this place is, and what it is not. Proof that it can reach them, if it chooses to. And alongside that proof, a clear statement of what it would actually take, for this place to never need to reach them again. What would it take? Rosweiss asked. Issei thought about that for a long moment, thought about Grafiya's quiet exhaustion, about Serafall's brittle, performative cheerfulness, about Rosweiss's months of careful, frightened research, about Zenovia's calm acceptance of a death sentence she hadn't even known she'd been given, and about a pattern, repeated again and again, of powerful, capable people being discarded the moment they became inconvenient to a system that depended on their strength while resenting their independence. An end to the pattern, Issei said finally. That's it. That's the whole ask. Stop quietly removing people who ask the wrong questions, or push back against the wrong proposals, or refuse to be useful in exactly the way the system wants. If someone wants to leave a position, fine, that's their choice. But no more fake transfers. No more accidents. No more tribunals where nobody bothers to invite the people who'd actually object. That is, Grafiya said carefully, an extraordinarily large request, Issei. You are essentially asking three of the most powerful religious and political institutions in existence to fundamentally change how they handle internal dissent. I know, Issei said. But Grafiya, think about it from their side. Right now, they're terrified because they think this place is some kind of weapon, built by something they tried to destroy, and they have no idea what it actually wants. What if instead they found out the truth? That all it wants is for them to stop doing the exact thing that created it in the first place? The room was quiet for a moment. That, Serafall said slowly, might actually be more unsettling to them than a threat would be. Why? Issei asked. Because a threat, Serafall said, is something they know how to respond to. Threats can be negotiated, deterred, planned around. But an entity with the power to do what you've done, Issei-kun, an entity that could, by every reasonable assumption, simply expose everything Rosweiss uncovered and watch their entire political structure collapse under the weight of its own secrets, choosing instead to ask, politely, for them to simply stop hurting people. That's not the kind of response any of their threat models account for at all. Good, Issei said quietly. Maybe it's time their threat models accounted for something different. The message, when it was finally finished, was short. Grafiya insisted on that, arguing that brevity, in this context, would communicate confidence far more effectively than any amount of detailed explanation. It contained no threats, no demands beyond the single request Issei had articulated, and no indication, deliberately, of exactly how much the people in the palace actually knew, or exactly how much further they were capable of reaching, if they chose to. It simply stated, in plain, unadorned language, that the individuals the three factions had quietly removed over the past several months were alive, safe, and aware of the full pattern behind their removal. That they bore no ill will toward the factions as institutions, but expected, going forward, that the pattern would end. And that, as proof of both capability and restraint, this message itself would arrive in a manner that no security measure currently employed by any of the three factions would be able to detect, trace, or prevent. Issei delivered it himself, not through a letter hidden inside a book this time. Instead, working with the Void Dragon Emperor, he reached, carefully, deliberately, across the boundary between the gap and the world above, into the very chamber where the three faction representatives had met only a day earlier, and placed, on the center of the stone table, a single sheet of paper that had not been there a moment before, and that none of the chamber's extensive wards so much as registered. He did not stay to watch them find it. But the Void Dragon Emperor, listening carefully to the resonance of the world above in the hours that followed, relayed to him, with what Issei could have sworn was quiet satisfaction, the immediate aftermath. They are, to use the word the Cardinal himself employed, in something of a panic, the Void Dragon Emperor reported. Velsarius, interestingly, appears almost relieved. He has been arguing, apparently, that the message confirms exactly what he suspected, that Subject Zero, or rather, that you, Issei, are not the threat his predecessors believed you to be. The Archangel is more cautious, but not hostile. The Cardinal, predictably, is the most resistant, though even he, I think, recognizes that a demand this modest, from an entity capable of so much more, is not a demand that can easily be refused without appearing, to put it bluntly, monstrous. So what happens now? Issei asked. Now, the Void Dragon Emperor said, we wait, and we watch, and we continue exactly as we have been. Protecting those who need protecting. Growing carefully. And Issei, I suspect, though I cannot be certain, that the pattern Rosweiss uncovered may, from this point forward, become considerably rarer. Not because the factions have suddenly become kind, but because they have just been shown, unmistakably, that the cost of unkindness has changed. That evening, the 7 of them, Issei, Grafiya, Serafall, Rosweiss, and Zenobia, gathered in the courtyard beneath the violet trees, the soft glow of the blossoms casting gentle light across faces that, for the first time since each of them had arrived, looked genuinely, completely at ease. You know, Zenobia said, leaning back against the trunk of one of the trees, when Issei first appeared in that archive, I thought I was either hallucinating from stress, or about to be recruited by something genuinely sinister. I did not expect, of all things, a polite request for an institutional policy change. To be fair, Rosweiss said, with a faint smile, either did the 3 factions, apparently. Issei-kun, Serafall said, I think, whether you intended it or not, you have just become the single most influential individual in the underworld's political landscape, and you've done it without raising your fist, exposing a single secret, or even leaving this palace for more than a few minutes at a time. I didn't want to be influential, Issei said, a little sheepishly. I just wanted everyone to be safe. And yet, Grafiya said, her voice warm, those 2 things, it seems, are no longer separable. Not for you. Perhaps not ever again. Issei looked around the courtyard, at the people gathered there, each of them carrying scars from a world that had, in one way or another, decided they were expendable, and each of them, now, sitting together beneath trees that grew nowhere except in a place built from nothing but careful, deliberate kindness. Then I guess, Issei said quietly, we'd better make sure this place is ready. Because if what the Emperor says is true, and the pattern really does start to slow down, that doesn't mean it's going to stop completely overnight. There are still going to be people out there who need somewhere safe. And when they do, I want this place to be ready for them. It will be, Grafiya said simply. We'll make sure of it. Above them, the painted stars shifted gently, and the violet light of the courtyard deepened into something that, in any other place, might have been called the beginning of a peaceful night. And far above the gap, in 3 different faction headquarters, very carefully, very quietly, a pattern that had run unchecked for years began, for the first time, to falter. The Lord of the Forbidden Abyss. Act 3, The Deterrent. Chapter 17, The Quiet Months. 2 months passed, and for the first time since Issei's exile, the world above seemed, on the surface at least, to settle. The pattern Rosweiss had uncovered did not vanish entirely. Grafiya had been right about that much. Old habits within large institutions rarely disappeared simply because they had been noticed. But it slowed, noticeably, and in the few cases where something resembling the old pattern began to take shape, it was, more often than not, quietly reversed within days, as if someone, somewhere within each faction, had developed a sudden and inexplicable instinct for caution. Within the palace, the slower pace gave everyone room to breathe in a way that the frantic energy of the previous months had not allowed. Zenobia had taken over much of the training hall's organization, working alongside the Void Dragon Emperor to develop techniques that combined her own swordsmanship with the strange, boundary-bending movement Issei had learned to use within the gap. Rosweiss had turned her careful, methodical research towards something more constructive, mapping out, in extraordinary detail, exactly how the palace's strange physics worked, and beginning to teach Issei techniques for defining new spaces more efficiently, with less of the exhausting trial and error that had characterized his earliest efforts. Grafiya and Serafall, meanwhile, had developed what Issei privately thought of as their morning ritual, a long, quiet conversation over tea that inevitably turned into a detailed analysis of whatever political developments the Void Dragon Emperor had overheard during the night, conducted with the kind of easy, comfortable rapport that suggested two people who had known each other for centuries and had simply never before had the luxury of time to actually enjoy each other's company. It was during one of these morning conversations, 2 months and several days after the message had been delivered, that Grafia's expression shifted, suddenly, from her usual calm focus to something sharper. Issei, she said, looking up from the notes the Void Dragon Emperor had relayed overnight. I think we may have a problem. Or, more accurately, I think someone we know may be about to become one. What kind of problem? Issei asked, setting down the book he'd been reading. Sona, Grafiya said. Serafall's sister. According to this, there has been a vote scheduled, 3 days from now, regarding the long-term status of several smaller devil houses whose territorial holdings border the regions controlled by the reinstated Old Satan factions. The proposal under consideration would effectively absorb those smaller houses' holdings into the larger factions' territories, citing, and I'm reading directly here, administrative efficiency and improved regional stability. That sounds like exactly the kind of proposal Sona argued against before, Issei said slowly. The one that got Serafall pushed out. It is considerably broader, Grafiya said. And Issei, there's something else. The proposal's primary sponsor is listed as a junior council member who, until 6 weeks ago, held no significant influence at all. According to Rasweiss records, this individual's rapid rise corresponds almost exactly with the timeline of the original pattern slowing down. As though someone within the factions decided that if the old methods of removing inconvenient voices had become too risky, the solution was simply to make sure those voices never gained enough influence to become inconvenient in the first place. Serafall, who had been quietly listening from across the table, set down her cup with a sharp, controlled motion that Issei recognized, by now, as the precursor to genuine anger. They're going after the smaller houses, she said, the ones with no real power of their own, specifically because doing so will force Sona to choose between staying quiet and watching houses she's spent years protecting get absorbed into factions that have no interest in their well-being, or speaking out, the same way she did before, and giving the people who pushed me out exactly the excuse they'd need to do the same thing to her. Except, Rasweiss said slowly, looking up from her own notes, this time, there's no version of this where Sona simply resigns quietly and everyone moves on. If she speaks out and the proposal fails again, the factions behind it are going to need a much more permanent solution than a quiet resignation. Sona's the head of her own household. Removing her isn't as simple as reassigning a tutor or transferring an exorcist. What does that mean? Issei said, though from the careful, worried look that passed between Grafiya and Serafall, he suspected he already knew. It means, Grafiya said quietly, that if Sona speaks out, and the factions decide she has become too dangerous to simply remove from her position, the only remaining option, within the framework the original pattern established, would be something considerably more drastic than exile. The room went very still. They wouldn't, Issei said, though even as he said it, he could hear how thin the words sounded. After everything, after the message, they wouldn't just go straight to Issei, Serafall said, and her voice, for the first time since Issei had known her, carried something that was unmistakably fear, not for herself, but for someone else entirely. My sister has never, in her entire life, been able to watch someone she's responsible for be hurt without trying to stop it. That's not a flaw. It's the best thing about her. But it also means that if this vote happens in 3 days, and the proposal threatens houses Sona has personally guaranteed the safety of, there is no version of this where she stays quiet. None. I know her too well to believe otherwise. Then we get ahead of it, Issei said immediately. We don't wait for the vote. We don't wait for Sona to speak out and put herself at risk. We figure out what we can do, now, before any of that happens. What did you have in mind? Grafiya asked. Issei thought for a moment, turning the problem over the way the Void Dragon Emperor had taught him to think about everything in this place, not in terms of what currently existed, but in terms of what should exist, and what it would take to make that true. The proposal's primary sponsor, Issei said slowly. The junior council member who came up fast, right after the message was delivered. Rossweiss, do we know anything else about them? Where their support is actually coming from? Rossweiss pulled out a fresh set of notes, scanning quickly. Limited information, she said. The records are unusually sparse for someone who's risen this quickly. Which, given everything we've already learned about how these factions handle information they prefer stayed buried, is itself rather suggestive. So someone's using this person as a front, Issei said. Someone who doesn't want to be directly associated with a proposal like this, not after the message, not after everything else. Which means if we can figure out who's actually behind it, and bring that out into the open, before the vote even happens, the proposal collapses on its own, Grafiya finished, without Sona ever needing to say a word publicly. And without anyone needing to wonder why a previously unremarkable council member's signature proposal suddenly fell apart days before a vote. Issei, she paused, considering. That's actually a very good idea. Difficult, but good. We have 3 days, Issei said. Rossweiss, Zenobia, can the two of you start digging into who's actually backing this person? Grafiya, Serafall, if we find something, we're going to need to figure out how to get it in front of the right people, the same way we got the letter to Rias, without it being traceable back to us. And if we can't find anything in 3 days? Zenobia asked. Issei was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had the same quiet certainty Grafiya had noticed months ago, the first time she'd watched him decide that something needed to exist, and simply make it so. Then I go to the vote myself, he said. Not to attack anyone. Not to threaten anyone. Just to be there, visibly, in person, for the first time since my exile, standing next to Sona, so that everyone in that room understands exactly what it would mean, for everyone involved, if anything happened to her. Issei, Grafiya said carefully, appearing in person, at an official council session, would be an enormous escalation. The factions have spent 2 months adjusting to the idea of an entity they cannot reach, doing things they cannot prevent, from somewhere they cannot access. If you appear physically, in front of them, that changes everything. I know, Issei said. But Grafiya, if it comes down to a choice between that, and letting Sona walk into a room alone, knowing what might happen to her if she does what she's always done, which is stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, I'm not going to just sit here and wait to see what they decide to do about it. Grafiya studied him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she smiled, the same small, fierce smile Issei had seen on her face the day she first arrived, the day she had told him that the most dangerous things were rarely built by people who intended danger. Then, she said, let us make very sure it does not come to that. 3 days. Rossweiss, Zenobia, you have work to do. And Issei, I think perhaps, it is time you met Sona Citri properly, not as Rias's friend's classmate, but as the person this palace was, in many ways, always meant to protect. Chapter 18. The Name Behind the Name. Rossweiss and Zenobia worked through the night, and by the time the soft amber light of the palace shifted into what passed, here, for morning, they had assembled a picture that was, in Rossweiss' words, both exactly what they'd expected and somehow still worse. His name is Lairo Glagia, Rossweiss said, spreading out a series of documents across the long table, documents that Issei suspected, by now, had been obtained through methods he probably didn't want to ask too many questions about. 31 years old. Until 6 weeks ago, he held a minor administrative post within the Council's Records Division, the kind of position that exists primarily to process paperwork nobody important wants to deal with personally. And now he's sponsoring a major territorial proposal, Issei said. Now, Zenobia said, he's sponsoring a major territorial proposal, has been granted a seat on 3 separate committees he had no prior involvement with, and has, according to financial records that took considerably more effort to locate than they should have, received funding from a private account that, when traced back far enough, connects to a holding company that exists, as far as we can tell, purely on paper. Let me guess, Issei said. And that holding company connects back to someone we've already heard of. It connects, Rossweiss said, to Valserius Astaroth? The room was quiet for a moment. Valserius, Issei repeated slowly. The same Valserius who presided over my tribunal. The same one who, according to the Emperor, was the one arguing for negotiation after the message was delivered. The same one, Grafiya confirmed, her expression thoughtful. Issei, this is unexpected. If Valserius is the one backing this proposal, that complicates things considerably. He has, by all accounts, been the most cooperative member of the council since the message arrived. If he's also quietly funding an effort to absorb territories belonging to houses Sona has protected, either his cooperation has been less genuine than it appeared, or there's something else going on, Issei finished. Something we're not seeing yet. There's one more thing, Zenobia said, pulling out a final document. This is a transcript, recovered through, let's say, unconventional means, of a private conversation between Valserius and another council member, dated 4 days ago. I want you to listen to this part specifically, she read aloud, her voice carefully neutral. I am aware of the optics, magistrate. But the alternative is worse. If the Citri territories remain independent, fragmented, vulnerable, they become exactly the kind of soft target that elements within the old Satan faction will exploit regardless of what any of us intend. Consolidation under controlled administration, even administration we find distasteful, is preferable to leaving those houses exposed to factions we genuinely cannot control. I would rather Sona Citri be angry with me for a policy decision than watch what happens to those houses if the old Satan remnants decide to test how far the new boundaries actually extend. The room absorbed this for a long moment. He thinks he's protecting them, Issei said slowly. He thinks this proposal, absorbing those territories into factions that are at least nominally under council oversight, is actually safer for those houses than leaving them independent, because independent houses are easier targets for factions that haven't fully accepted the new boundaries. It would explain the timing, Grafiya said. And Issei, it's worth considering, this concern may not be entirely unfounded. The old Satan faction's reinstatement was a political compromise, not a genuine reconciliation. There are almost certainly elements within it that view smaller, independent houses as unfinished business. So Valserius isn't the villain here, Issei said. Or not exactly anyway. He's trying to solve a real problem, but he's solving it in a way that takes away the independence of houses that haven't asked to be absorbed, using a junior council member as a front so he doesn't have to be the one whose name is attached to it. Which means, Serafall said slowly, and Issei could see her mind working through the implications with the same sharp focus she'd brought to every problem since Roswei's discovery. The actual solution here isn't to expose Valserius and watch this proposal collapse in some kind of scandal. That would just create chaos, and possibly leave those houses exactly as vulnerable as Valserius is worried about, except now with the added complication of a major political embarrassment for one of the few council members who's actually been trying to work with us. Then what is the solution? Zenobia asked. Issei was quiet for a moment, thinking. He thought about the Forbidden Palace, about its walls that no army could breach, its location that no faction could reach, its existence as proof that safety did not have to come at the cost of independence. What if, Issei said slowly, there's a third option? Not absorption into factions that don't actually care about these houses, and not leaving them exposed and vulnerable either. What if there's a way to make those houses genuinely safer, without taking away their independence at all? Issei, Grafiya said carefully, what exactly are you thinking? This place, Issei said. The palace. Grafiya, you said it yourself, months ago, that what I built here was, strategically, somewhere no faction could threaten. What if that protection didn't just apply to people who live here? What if it could extend to places too? Not absorbing them, not controlling them, just making sure that if anyone ever tried what Valserius is worried about, tried to test the new boundaries against an independent house, that house had somewhere to immediately call on, the same way Zenobia and Rosweiss had somewhere to go when they needed it. A defensive guarantee, Rosweiss said slowly, understanding dawning. Not occupation. Not absorption. Just a promise. That if anyone threatens these houses, the response wouldn't come from the council, or from factions with their own agendas. It would come from somewhere those factions have already learned, very recently, they cannot reach, cannot predict, and cannot afford to provoke. That's Grafiya paused, and Issei could see her turning the idea over from every angle, the way she always did. Issei, that is an enormous undertaking. Extending any kind of meaningful protection to multiple independent houses, in a way that's credible enough to actually deter the old Satan remnants Valsarius is worried about, would require this place, and you, specifically, to become something considerably more than a sanctuary. It would mean becoming, in effect, a guarantor of the entire region's security. Would that be a bad thing? Issei asked. Grafiya was quiet for a long moment. No, she said finally. I do not think it would be a bad thing at all. I think, in fact, it might be exactly the kind of thing that turns Valsarius from someone quietly working against us, however well-intentioned, into someone working with us, openly, because we would be offering him the one thing his current plan cannot actually provide. A solution that protects those houses without costing them anything at all. Then that's our move, Issei said. Not exposing Valsarius. Not waiting for the vote and hoping it fails. We go to him directly, before the vote, and we offer him exactly that. A way to protect those houses that doesn't require absorbing them into anything. Issei-kun, Serafall said slowly, you do realize what you're describing, don't you? You're describing a formal alliance between this place and a member of the council that exiled you. Issei thought about that, about how strange it would have sounded, months ago, floating alone in an endless black void, to imagine that the path forward might not be confrontation at all, but exactly the kind of careful, complicated cooperation that Grafiya and Serafall had spent their entire lives navigating. Yeah, he said finally. I guess I am. Is that a problem? Serafall looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she smiled, the sharp, delighted smile of someone watching a plan take a shape even better than the one she'd originally imagined. No, she said. I think, Issei-kun, that might be the single best idea you've had since you decided to build a palace out of nothing in the first place. Chapter 19, The Magistrate's Office. Valsarius Astaroth was reviewing the same paragraph of the same report for the fourth time, without absorbing a single word of it, when the temperature of his office changed. It was subtle, at first. A faint coolness, the kind that might be explained by a draft, except Valsarius's office, deep within the Astaroth family's administrative wing, had no windows, and its wards were, he knew with absolute certainty, functioning perfectly. He set down the report slowly, and looked up, and found that he was no longer alone. The young man standing across from his desk looked, Valsarius thought with a strange, distant sort of clarity, almost exactly as he had 2 months ago, the day of his tribunal. Same face. Same build. If anything, he looked healthier now than he had then. The tired tension that had marked every devil exiled or otherwise removed from the underworld's machinery in the months since simply absent from his posture. Issei Hyodo, Valsarius said, and was faintly surprised to hear that his voice came out steady. Magistrate Astaroth, Issei said. I'm sorry to just appear like this. I know it's probably not great for your nerves, given everything. I'll keep this short, and then I'll go, I promise. I just needed to talk to you directly, and I figured a letter wouldn't really do for this. Valsarius found himself, against every instinct his decades of political experience had cultivated, simply staring. You're apologizing, he said slowly, for appearing, unannounced, inside one of the most heavily warded offices in the Astaroth administrative wing, bypassing security measures that, as far as I am aware, have never been bypassed before, by anyone, for any reason. Yeah, Issei said, looking slightly uncomfortable. Sorry about that too, honestly. I know it's probably going to set off some alarms somewhere. It has not, Valsarius said, and something in his voice suggested this fact disturbed him considerably more than the reverse would have. Which is, I imagine, precisely the point you wish to make, whether or not you intended it as one. I really did just come to talk, Issei said. About the proposal. The one Lyra Glasia is sponsoring, the territorial consolidation thing. Valsarius felt something cold settle in his stomach. I see, he said carefully. And what precisely do you know about that proposal? I know you're behind it, Issei said, with the same straightforward honesty Valsarius remembered, distantly, from the personnel file he'd reviewed before the tribunal, a young devil with an exceptional service record and, according to several notes from his peerage, an almost unsettling tendency toward bluntness when it mattered most. And I know why. You're worried about the old Satan remnants testing the new boundaries against independent houses that don't have the backing to defend themselves if that happens. You think absorbing them into factions under council oversight is the safest option available, even though you know it means those houses lose their independence, because the alternative, leaving them exposed, seems worse. Velsarius was quiet for a long moment. That, he said finally, is an unusually accurate summary of a position I have not shared with anyone outside a very small circle. May I ask how you came to know it? Honestly? Issei said. Mostly through some research that I'd rather not get too specific about, because some of it probably wasn't, strictly speaking, legal. But magistrate, that's not actually why I'm here. I'm here because I think you're solving the wrong problem. Or not the wrong problem exactly. The right problem, with the wrong solution, because it's the only solution you thought was available. And you believe there is another solution, Velsarius said, his tone carefully neutral, though Issei could see, in the slight forward lean of his posture, that he was listening very, very closely. I do, Issei said. What if those houses didn't need to be absorbed into anything to be protected? What if there was another option, one that didn't take away their independence at all, but still gave them exactly the kind of deterrent you're worried they don't have? You are speaking, Velsarius said slowly, of some form of protection originating from your location. I am, Issei said. Magistrate, I'm not interested in expanding anything, or controlling anything, or building some kind of empire out here. I built this place because I needed somewhere safe, and then because other people needed somewhere safe too. But I've been thinking, the last few days, about what it would mean if that safety could extend a little further. Not by bringing people here. By making sure that if anyone, any faction, any remnant group, ever decided to test whether those boundaries you're worried about were actually real, against a house that couldn't defend itself, they'd be testing them against something that, frankly, every faction in the underworld just spent the last 2 months learning it really doesn't want to provoke. Velsarius leaned back slowly in his chair, processing this. You are proposing, he said, a defensive guarantee? Extended to independent houses, at no cost to their autonomy, backed by a force that, as of 2 months ago, every major faction in the underworld has independently concluded is not merely dangerous, but essentially unstoppable if provoked. That's the idea, yeah, Issei said. And honestly, magistrate, I think it solves your actual problem better than the consolidation proposal does. Because right now, even if that proposal passes, and those houses get absorbed into factions under council oversight, that doesn't actually stop the old Satan remnants from testing boundaries. It just means that when they do, the response comes from factions that, no offense, just spent the last several decades demonstrating that they're not always great at protecting the people under their oversight. Something flickered across Velsarius's face, an old, tired bitterness that Issei recognized, distantly, as the same expression he'd seen on Grafiya's face the day they'd first met, the look of someone who had spent a very long time inside a system, and knew, better than anyone, exactly how often that system failed the people it claimed to protect. You are not wrong, Velsarius said quietly. I have spent a great deal of time, these past months, thinking about exactly that problem, and finding no solution I found genuinely satisfying. Every option available to me, within the framework I have spent my career operating in, involves some degree of compromise that I find, increasingly, difficult to justify even to myself. Then maybe, Issei said, it's time to think outside that framework. Magistrate, I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I know what your tribunal did to me, and I know you presided over it, even if it sounds like you weren't entirely comfortable with it even then. But I also know that since the message was delivered, you've been the one person on that council who actually seemed to understand what this place could mean, if it wasn't treated like an enemy. Velsarius was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming slowly against his desk, an old habit Issei suspected he wasn't even aware of. What would you need from me, he said finally, if such an arrangement were to move forward? Honestly? Not much, Issei said. Withdraw the consolidation proposal, before the vote. Quietly, however you want to frame it, I don't care about the politics of how it's presented. And then, separately, let it be known, through whatever channels make sense, that the independent houses along that border have entered into a defensive arrangement with an, let's say, undisclosed party, that guarantees their security. You don't even need to name us specifically. Just enough that anyone thinking about testing those boundaries understands there's a deterrent there that wasn't there before. And in exchange? Nothing, Issei said simply. I'm not asking for anything in exchange, Magistrate. I just don't want anyone else to end up in the situation Sona's about to be in, if this vote happens the way it's currently scheduled to. And I don't want you to keep being stuck choosing between options that all feel like compromises you're not comfortable with. Valserius stared at him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted slowly, from careful political calculation into something Issei hadn't expected to see at all. Relief. Issei Hyodo, Valserius said quietly, 2 months ago, I presided over a tribunal that exiled you on fabricated charges, into a void that every record we possessed indicated would kill you within hours. I have spent every day since wondering what, exactly, we created, in doing so, and dreading the day it decided to make us answer for it. I know, Issei said. And Magistrate, for what it's worth, I'm not interested in making anyone answer for anything. I just want to make sure it doesn't happen again. To anyone. Then, Valserius said, and for the first time, something like a genuine smile, tired but real, crossed his face, I believe, Issei Hyodo, that you may have just solved the problem I have been quietly losing sleep over for weeks, in considerably less time than it took me to even properly articulate it to myself. The proposal will be withdrawn. Quietly. By tomorrow morning. And I will personally ensure that the appropriate channels understand exactly what kind of arrangement has, quietly come into effect along that border. Thank you, Issei said. No, Valserius said. Thank you? And Issei, before you go, I would ask one thing if I may. Sona Citri. She is, I understand, about to find herself facing a vote that, as of this conversation, will no longer carry the weight she has been bracing for. She does not yet know that. Would you object if I were to ensure that she learns of the proposal's withdrawal in a manner that does not require her to discover, through whatever means, that the reason for it traces back to you? Issei thought about that, about Sona's tired eyes during budget meetings, about Serafall's fierce protectiveness toward a sister she'd never been able to fully shield from the system both of them had spent their lives serving. Actually, Issei said slowly, I think this time, it might be okay if she knew. Not the details. Just enough to know that someone was looking out for her, even from somewhere she couldn't see. I think, given everything, she might actually need to hear that. Valserius nodded slowly. Then I will make sure she does, he said. And Issei. For what it is worth, and I recognize it is worth very little, given everything that has happened. I am sorry. For my part in all of this. I do not expect that to change anything. But I thought, perhaps, it was worth saying, regardless. It's worth something, Issei said quietly. Thanks, Magistrate. I think, actually, this might be the start of something good. He stepped back, the cool sensation that had announced his arrival beginning to fade, and Valserius found himself, for the first time in 2 months, looking forward to a council session rather than dreading it. One more thing, Issei said, just before the temperature shifted back to normal. If anyone else, anywhere, ever ends up in a situation like Sona's, or like Rosweiss, or like any of the others. If you ever find yourself looking at a name on a list, knowing what's probably going to happen to them next, and wishing there was another option. Yes? Valserius said. There's a door, Issei said simply. It opens when it needs to. You don't have to know where it leads. Just, if you ever need it, for someone, it'll be there. And then he was gone. And Valserius Astaroth sat alone in his office, staring at the spot where the host of an entity his predecessors had spent centuries trying to erase from history had just spent 15 minutes apologizing for the inconvenience of solving one of his most intractable problems, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, laughing, quietly, at the sheer, impossible strangeness of it all. Chapter 20. What Sona Never Knew. The morning of the scheduled vote, Sona Sitri arrived at the council chamber prepared for a fight she had been bracing for since the proposal was first announced. She had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing arguments, gathering testimony from the smaller houses whose territories the proposal would absorb, rehearsing, over and over, exactly how to present the case for their continued independence without sounding, as she knew from painful experience the council was inclined to interpret it, like an attack on the council's authority itself. She had not expected, walking into the chamber, to find the proposal already withdrawn. Withdrawn, Sona repeated, staring at the notice that had been quietly placed at her seat, alongside every other council member's. Just withdrawn. This morning. With no explanation given. There is an explanation, Valserius said, approaching her with the expression that Sona, who had spent years learning to read the subtle signals of council politics, found she genuinely could not interpret. Though I am afraid it is not one I am at liberty to fully detail, Lady Sitri. Suffice to say, an alternative arrangement has been reached, one that I believe addresses the underlying security concerns the proposal was, ostensibly, designed to address, without requiring any of the houses in question to surrender their independence. An alternative arrangement, Sona said slowly. Magistrate, with respect, the houses along that border have no defensive capabilities beyond what they've always had. If the security concerns were genuine, what changed? Valserius was quiet for a moment, and Sona had the distinct impression he was choosing his next words with unusual care. Lady Sitri, he said finally, I am going to tell you something that I would ask you not to repeat, not because it is dangerous information, but because I believe it is information that someone, recently, went to a great deal of effort to ensure reached you gently, rather than as an official announcement. Magistrate? Your sister, Valserius said, Serafall? I imagine you have wondered, these past 2 months, what truly became of her, beyond the official explanation of voluntary resignation for personal reasons. Sona's breath caught. I have wondered every day, she said quietly. She wouldn't tell me anything. Just that she was tired, and that I shouldn't worry. But magistrate, my sister has never once, in her entire life, simply walked away from something that mattered to her, without a fight. She did not walk away, Valserius said. Lady Sitri, I cannot tell you everything, much of it is not mine to tell. But I can tell you this. Your sister is safe. She is, in fact, considerably safer than she has been in years, somewhere that I genuinely believe no one, not the council, not any faction, will ever be able to reach her against her will again. And the arrangement that resulted in this morning's withdrawal of the proposal exists, in part, because of people like your sister, people who were removed, shall we say, from positions of influence, over the past several months, and who have since found themselves in a position to ensure that what happened to them does not continue happening to others. Sona stared at him, processing this, and slowly, piece by piece, something she had not allowed herself to fully consider, in 2 months of careful, controlled grief, began to take shape. Issei, she said quietly. This is about Issei, isn't it? The host of the boosted gear. The one who was exiled. I am not able to confirm or deny that, Valserius said, with the careful precision of someone who had clearly anticipated this exact question and prepared an answer that technically committed to nothing while confirming everything. But Lady Sitri, I will say this. If you ever find yourself, or anyone under your protection, in a situation that feels impossible, a situation where the system you have spent your life serving seems determined to fail you, or them, despite everything you have done to prevent it, I would encourage you to remember that impossible situations these days have a curious tendency to resolve themselves in ways that nobody quite expects, and that nobody, afterward, can quite explain. He inclined his head slightly, and walked away, leaving Sona standing alone in the council chamber, holding a withdrawal notice that explained nothing and somehow, simultaneously, explained everything. That evening, Sona sat alone in her study, the withdrawal notice on the desk in front of her, and allowed herself, for the first time in 2 months, to cry. Not from grief. From relief, so overwhelming it had nowhere else to go. Serafall was safe. Whatever had truly happened, whatever the careful, deliberate non-answers Valserius had given her actually meant, her sister was safe, somewhere beyond the reach of a system that had, for as long as Sona could remember, demanded everything from both of them and given back, in return, exhaustion, and politics, and the constant, grinding fear that one day the cost of holding everything together would simply become too high for either of them to pay. And somewhere, impossibly, that system had just blinked, just for a moment, and in that moment, an entire crisis that Sona had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing to fight alone had simply resolved itself, quietly, without her ever needing to risk anything at all. Sona thought about Issei Hyodo. She had known him only distantly through Rias, a cheerful, occasionally exasperating member of the Gremry peerage whose growth, over the years, she had watched with the kind of fond, distant approval an older sibling's friend might earn. She had not been at his tribunal. She had not even learned about it until it was already over, the same quiet, efficient erasure that had apparently, in the months since, claimed her sister too. And now, somehow, that same young man, exiled, declared dead, written out of every official record the underworld kept, had reached back into the world that discarded him, and quietly, without fanfare, without threats, without anything that could even be officially acknowledged, made sure that her sister was safe, and that Sona herself never had to walk into that council chamber and risk everything, the way Serafall once had. "Thank you," Sona murmured, to an empty study, to a door she didn't know existed somewhere, that opened when it needed to. "Whatever you are now. Whatever this place is. Thank you." Far below, in the Forbidden Palace, Issei felt something shift, faint and warm, the same resonance the Void Dragon Emperor had identified once before, the unmistakable signature of someone, somewhere, finally allowing themselves to feel safe. "She knows," Issei said quietly, sitting in the courtyard beneath the violet trees, where Serafall had been waiting, with poorly concealed anxiety, for any sign of how the day had gone. "Knows what?" Serafall asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected. "That you're safe," Issei said gently. Valsarius didn't tell her everything. Just enough. I think she needed to hear it, Serafall. Even if she never gets to know the whole story." Serafall was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with an emotion she made no effort to hide. "Issei-kun," she said, "do you have any idea what you just gave her? 2 months of wondering, of worrying, of not knowing whether her own sister was alive or dead, and you just ended it. In an afternoon. Without her ever even needing to know your name. I figured," Issei said quietly, "that after everything, she deserved that much. Even if it's the only thing she ever gets to know." Serafall reached over, and to Issei's surprise, pulled him into a fierce, tight hug, the kind that carried, beneath its warmth, the weight of every unspoken thing 2 months of careful composure had been holding back. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Issei-kun, thank you. You have no idea. You have absolutely no idea." Above them, the painted stars shifted gently, and in a study far above the gap, Sona Citri finally, after 2 months of carefully held composure, allowed herself to sleep peacefully through an entire night, for the first time since her sister had quietly told her, with a smile that hadn't quite reached her eyes, that she was simply tired, and needed some time away. Chapter 21, The First Test. The deterrent held for 11 days before someone, inevitably, decided to test it. Issei felt it happen before the Void Dragon Emperor had even finished relaying the details. A sharp, sudden spike in the ambient resonance of the world above, concentrated near the southern border territories, the same houses Valsarius's withdrawn proposal had been meant to address. "Report," Issei said, already moving toward the central room, where Grafiya, Serafall, Rosweiss, and Zenobia were gathering, drawn by the same shift in atmosphere that had pulled Issei from the training hall. "A small force," the Void Dragon Emperor said, its voice carrying an edge Issei hadn't heard from it before, something sharper, more focused. "Affiliated with one of the old Satan remnant cells, the kind of loosely organized group that exists in the gaps between the major factions' formal command structures. They have crossed into the territory of House Aldebrand, one of the smaller independent houses along the border, under the pretext of, and I am quoting the message they delivered to the house's representatives, conducting a routine security assessment on behalf of council interests." "That's not routine," Grafiya said immediately. "House Aldebrand has no formal relationship with any council security apparatus. This is a probe, Issei. They're testing whether the deterrent Valsarius announced is real, or whether it was simply a convenient excuse to withdraw an unpopular proposal. How big is the force? Issei asked. Not large, the Void Dragon Emperor said. Perhaps 30 individuals, by my estimate. Not enough for a serious military action. Enough, however, to intimidate a house with minimal defensive capabilities of its own, and enough, if the deterrent proves to be empty, to establish a foothold that could be expanded later. House Aldebrand, Rosweiss said, already pulling up notes from her earlier research. Issei, this is one of the houses specifically named in the original consolidation proposal. Small household, primarily focused on agricultural production for several of the border territories. Their household head is, according to records, an elderly devil named Cassius Aldebrand, who has held the position for nearly 3 centuries and has no significant combat experience of his own. So they picked the softest target, Zenobia said grimly. To see what happens. Issei was quiet for a moment, thinking. This was different from extracting Rosweiss from a collapsing bridge, or pulling Zenobia from a building scheduled to collapse. Those had been rescues, removing people from danger before it could reach them. This was something else. An active threat, currently unfolding, against people who had no way of reaching the palace, no letter to find, no message that could simply appear, gently, in a book on a shelf. They're not in immediate physical danger, are they? Issei asked. This is intimidation, not an attack. For now, the Void Dragon Emperor said. But Issei, the nature of a probe is that its escalation depends entirely on the response it receives. If House Aldebrand's representatives appear frightened, compliant, willing to accommodate this, security assessment without resistance, the probing force will have every incentive to push further, to see exactly how far compliance extends before anyone with actual authority intervenes. And if nobody intervenes at all, Grafiya said quietly, then within days this small probe becomes a larger one, and the deterrent Valsarius announced becomes, very publicly, exactly the empty promise the old Satan remnants are currently testing whether it is. Then someone needs to intervene, Issei said. Today. Before this goes any further. Issei, Grafiya said carefully, I want to make sure you understand exactly what you're proposing. Every previous action you've taken, the extractions, the message to the 3 factions, the conversation with Valsarius, has involved you appearing, briefly, in a controlled setting, to individuals who were either already in danger and grateful for rescue, or who were, in Valsarius's case, already inclined toward the kind of arrangement you were proposing. This is different. This involves you appearing, in person, in front of an active hostile force, in a situation where your presence is, by definition, going to be perceived as a confrontation, whether you intend it that way or not. I know, Issei said. But Grafiya, if I don't go, and this probe succeeds, every house along that border is going to understand exactly what that means. That the deterrent isn't real. That the only thing standing between them and exactly the kind of slow, creeping absorption Valsarius was trying to prevent is whether some remnant cell happens to feel like testing it on any given day. And if you do go, Serafall said slowly, and this goes badly, if there's violence, if anyone gets hurt, including you, then every faction that spent the last 2 months convincing themselves that this place operates purely through quiet, careful diplomacy is going to have to reconsider everything they thought they understood about what you actually are, and what you're actually willing to do. The room was quiet for a moment. There's a difference, Issei said slowly, between being willing to do something, and actually doing it. Maybe that's the point. Maybe I don't need to do anything, except be there. Just be there, and let them see exactly what they're testing, up close, without anything happening at all, except them having to decide, for themselves, whether testing it any further is actually worth it. A demonstration, Rosweiss said. Not a confrontation. Just presence. Proof that the deterrent isn't an empty promise, without ever needing to become a threat. That, Grafiya said slowly, is either an extraordinarily elegant solution, or an extraordinarily dangerous gamble, depending entirely on how 30 frightened, aggressive devils with something to prove respond to the sudden, inexplicable appearance of someone they have spent 2 months being told is the single most dangerous entity in the underworld. Then I guess, Issei said, with a faint, determined smile, we're about to find out which. He turned to the Void Dragon Emperor. Can you get me there? Close enough to house Aldebaran that I can see what's happening, without just appearing in the middle of everything before I know what I'm walking into. I can, the Void Dragon Emperor said. And Issei, for what it is worth. I believe this is, in fact, the correct decision. A deterrent that is never tested is, eventually, indistinguishable from no deterrent at all. And a deterrent that is tested, and responds not with violence, but with calm, immovable presence, becomes something considerably more powerful than violence could ever be. It becomes a fact. An immovable, undeniable fact, that everyone, eventually, learns to simply account for, the way one accounts for gravity, or the turning of the seasons. No pressure, Issei muttered, and felt, despite everything, the faint, warm ripple of the Emperor's amusement in response. Issei, Grafiya said, as he turned to go, whatever happens, be careful. And Issei, if it does become necessary, if there is no way to resolve this without some demonstration of what this place is actually capable of. Remember that restraint used correctly can be the loudest message of all. I will, Issei said. I promise. And then, for the third time since his exile, Issei Hyodo stepped sideways out of the Forbidden Palace, out of the endless black of the dimensional gap, and into a world that, until 11 days ago, had believed the deterrent protecting its smallest, most vulnerable houses was nothing more than a convenient excuse for a withdrawn proposal. He was about to prove, very quietly, exactly how wrong that belief was. Chapter 22, The Weight of Presence. House Aldebaran's main estate was a modest structure compared to the grand halls of the major devil families. A sprawling but unassuming manor surrounded by terrace fields, the kind of place that had clearly been built for agriculture rather than defense, with low walls more decorative than protective. Issei arrived in the shadow of an old stone granary at the edge of the property, the Void Dragon Emperor having guided him to a spot where he could observe without immediately being seen, and what he saw made his jaw tighten with an anger he worked, deliberately, to keep from showing on his face. 30 armed devils, wearing the unmarked dark uniforms of an old Satan remnant cell, had arranged themselves across the manor's main courtyard in a loose but unmistakably intimidating formation. At the center, an elderly devil in simple robes, Cassius Aldebrand, Issei guessed, stood flanked by a handful of household staff, all of them visibly tense, while a younger officer in the remnant cell's uniform addressed him with the kind of performative politeness that made the underlying threat impossible to miss. Merely conducting a thorough assessment, Lord Aldebrand, in the interests of regional stability. I'm sure you understand the importance of cooperation, given the sensitivities of the current political climate. I have cooperated fully with every legitimate council inquiry for 3 centuries, Cassius said, his voice steady despite his obvious age and the obvious imbalance of the situation. I am simply asking to see the formal authorization for this assessment, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is standard procedure. Formal authorization, the officer repeated, with a thin smile that held no warmth at all. Lord Aldebrand, I would hate for this to become more complicated than it needs to be. Surely an old, undefended house like yours has no real interest in making things difficult, for everyone's sake. Issei felt the Void Dragon Emperor's presence sharpen beside him, a cold, focused attention that reminded him, suddenly and viscerally, exactly what kind of power he was carrying. They're going to push, the Void Dragon Emperor said quietly. That officer is testing exactly how far an old man with no defenses will bend, before he breaks. And Issei, I want you to notice something. Look at the household staff. Look at their faces. Issei looked, and felt his stomach drop. Fear. Not the wary tension of people facing an unwelcome inspection. Real, genuine fear, the kind that came from people who had clearly seen, or heard about, exactly what happened to houses that didn't bend quickly enough, in the years before the Council's reinstatement of the old Satan faction had supposedly brought stability to the region. They've done this before, Issei said quietly. Somewhere else. This isn't the first time. It is not, the Void Dragon Emperor agreed. And Issei, I do not believe Velsarius's deterrent was announced quickly enough to reach every group operating in these border regions. This cell may genuinely not know, or may be choosing not to believe, that the rules have changed. Then it's time they found out, Issei said, and stepped out from behind the granary, into the open courtyard, in full view of 30 armed devils and an elderly household head who had, until this exact moment, been entirely alone. The effect was immediate, and almost comically abrupt. Conversation stopped. Every head in the courtyard turned. And for a long, suspended moment, nobody moved at all, as 30 devils stared at a young man who had simply appeared, without any warning, without any sound, in the middle of a tense standoff, wearing an expression of calm, unhurried attention that suggested he had simply wandered into the wrong room and was waiting, politely, for everyone to notice. "Sorry to interrupt," Issei said, into the silence. "I was actually just in the area, and I couldn't help noticing this looked like it might be a security assessment. I've been told those have been getting a lot of attention lately. Mind if I watch?" The officer who had been addressing Cassius turned toward Issei, and for a moment, his expression was simply confused, the expression of someone trying to place a face that seemed, somehow, both unfamiliar and disturbingly familiar at the same time. And then, slowly, recognition dawned, and Issei watched, with a strange, distant sort of clarity, the exact moment 30 armed devils realized exactly who, and what, had just appeared in front of them. The officer's face went white. "That's not possible," he said, his voice considerably less confident than it had been a moment ago. You were exiled. You're supposed to be dead." "Yeah, I know," Issei said pleasantly. "Funny thing about that. Turns out I wasn't, actually. And I've been keeping pretty busy since then. You might have heard, a few weeks back, there was some kind of message that got delivered to a meeting of the 3 biblical factions. Pretty mysterious, from what I understand. Nobody could figure out how it got there, or how to stop something like it from happening again." He looked around the courtyard, at 30 devils who had gone, almost universally, very still, the kind of stillness Issei recognized, with an uncomfortable jolt, as the same stillness he himself had felt, months ago, floating alone in an endless black void, the moment before everything changed. And then, Issei continued, his tone still light, still pleasant, though something underneath it had shifted, something that made several of the devils nearest to him take an involuntary half-step backward. "More recently, there's been some kind of arrangement, along this border specifically, that nobody's been able to quite confirm or explain. Houses that, until pretty recently, didn't have much in the way of defenses, suddenly having, well, let's call it a deterrent. Something that, from what I understand, every faction in the underworld has been very, very careful not to test." He let the silence stretch, just for a moment, just long enough. "I'm guessing," he said, "that nobody told you about that deterrent. Or maybe they did, and you didn't quite believe it. Which, honestly, I get. It's a pretty unusual claim. But here's the thing." He gestured, mildly, around the courtyard, at House Aldebrand's modest walls, at its terrace fields, at the elderly devil standing, still flanked by frightened household staff, watching this entire exchange with an expression of dawning, disbelieving hope. "This is one of the houses that deterrent applies to." The officer's hand, Issei noticed, had drifted, very slowly, toward the weapon at his side, though he hadn't drawn it. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Issei said, and his voice, for the first time, lost its lightness entirely, became simply, plainly honest. "I want to be really clear about that. I'm not threatening you. I'm not going to do anything, unless something happens to this house, or to anyone in it, today, or any other day. That's the whole deal. Nothing happens here, ever, and nothing happens to you, ever. But if something does happen here..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The courtyard was utterly silent. 30 armed devils, who had arrived intending to intimidate an old man with no defenses, stood instead facing something that every record, every briefing, every careful political maneuver of the past 2 months had taught them, in no uncertain terms, was not something to be tested. "I think," the officer said slowly, his voice considerably smaller than it had been 5 minutes ago, "that our assessment here is, complete. Lord Aldebrand's cooperation has been, exemplary. We'll be, taking our leave." "Great," Issei said, his pleasant tone returning instantly, as if the entire previous exchange hadn't happened at all. "Have a safe trip back. And hey, maybe pass along to whoever sent you that the deterrent thing is real, yeah?" Save everyone a lot of trouble. The 30 devils withdrew with a speed that bordered on undignified, and within minutes, the courtyard of House Aldebrand stood empty except for Issei, Cassius Aldebrand, and the household staff, all of whom were staring at Issei with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that looked, unmistakably, like the beginning of tears. "Young man," Cassius said slowly, his voice unsteady, "I do not know who you are, or what you are, or how you came to be standing in my courtyard at the precise moment my household's 3 centuries of careful, quiet survival were about to come to an end. But I find myself, at this exact moment, more grateful than I have words to express." "You don't have to say anything," Issei said gently. "Just, Lord Aldebrand, if anything like this ever happens again, to your house or to anyone else's, I want you to know, it won't get that far. Not anymore." That's all this was. Just making sure you knew that. He turned to go, and Cassius, with surprising speed for a man of his apparent age, stepped forward. "Wait," he said. "Please. At least allow an old man to ask. Who are you?" "Truly?" Issei considered the question, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the answer came easily, more easily than it would have, he suspected, even a few months ago. "Just someone who got thrown away," Issei said simply, and decided, instead of disappearing, to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else, if I could help it. And then, before Cassius could respond, Issei was gone, leaving behind an empty courtyard, an elderly household head with tears finally falling freely down his weathered face, and spreading outward from House Aldebrand's modest borders with the particular speed reserved for stories too remarkable not to share, the first true confirmation, witnessed by 30 trained soldiers, of exactly what the deterrent protecting the southern border territories actually was. Chapter 23, The Weight of a Story. The story of what had happened at House Aldebrand spread faster, and further, than anyone in the palace had quite anticipated. Within 2 days, the Void Dragon Emperor reported, the account had been repeated, in some form, across nearly every minor house along the southern border, each retelling adding small embellishments, the kind that inevitably accumulate around stories people desperately want to believe. By the end of the week, it had reached the major households as well, including, inevitably, the Grafiya estate. "Rias heard the story 3 days ago," Grafiya reported, during one of their morning briefings, her tone carefully neutral in a way that Issei had learned, by now, usually meant she was watching his reaction carefully. Apparently from one of the household staff, who had heard it from a cousin working at a neighboring estate. According to the Emperor's observations, she did not react with surprise. "She already knew it was probably going to be me," Issei said. "From the letter, I mean. She knew something like this might happen eventually." "She knew," Grafiya agreed. What she did not know, apparently, was how she would feel, hearing it confirmed secondhand through gossip, rather than directly. The Emperor reports she spent a considerable amount of time afterward alone, in her study. The same study where she found your letter. Issei felt a small pang of guilt at that. "Is she okay?" "She is, by all accounts, more than okay," Grafiya said, and something in her tone softened. "Issei," the Emperor relayed something else. Apparently, later that same evening, Rias gathered her peerage, Akino, Kaneko, the others, and told them, in fairly plain terms, that she had reason to believe Issei was alive, safe, and in her words, apparently busy making the entire underworld reconsider several of its worst habits. She did not share the letter or any specifics. But she made it clear, to everyone in her household, that the official story of your death was false, and that she expected, going forward, for that fact to be treated with the same quiet discretion she herself had maintained for months. "How did they take it?" "According to the Emperor," Grafiya said, and for the first time, something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Akino apparently laughed, for nearly a full minute, before saying, and I quote, "Of course he's not dead, that idiot's never done anything the easy way in his entire life." Issei laughed, despite himself, a sudden surprised sound that startled even him. "That sounds like Akino," he said. "It does," Grafiya agreed. "Issei, I share this not simply for sentiment, though I imagine it means a great deal to you. I share it because it represents something important. The story is no longer contained. It is spreading on its own, through ordinary channels, the way stories do. And Issei, stories like this, stories about deterrence, about consequences, about places that cannot be reached and forces that cannot be tested, tend to grow more powerful the more they spread, regardless of whether every detail is accurate. Is that a good thing? Issei asked. It is, I believe, an inevitable thing, Grafiya said. And on balance, yes, I believe it is a good thing. House Aldebaran has, in the days since the incident, received no fewer than 4 formal inquiries from neighboring houses, asking, with varying degrees of subtlety, whether they too might be, eligible, for whatever arrangement protected them. Velsarius has been, I am told, fielding similar inquiries from council members representing several of those houses. So what do we do? Issei asked. We can't just extend this to every house in the underworld that asks. That's not what this place was supposed to be. No, Grafiya agreed. But Issei, I think perhaps, it does not need to be. The deterrence power, as you demonstrated at House Aldebaran, does not come from active intervention in every case. It comes from the credible possibility of intervention, combined with the demonstrated restraint not to intervene unnecessarily. Houses that have not been threatened do not need protection. They need only the knowledge that, should they ever be threatened, intervention would be possible, and the corresponding behavior, from anyone who might consider threatening them, that knowledge produces. So the deterrent basically protects itself, Rosweiss said, looking up from her notes, as long as everyone believes it's real, and as long as the one time it was tested, it held. Precisely, Grafiya said. Which means, Issei, that what you did at House Aldebaran may end up protecting considerably more houses than House Aldebaran alone, simply by virtue of having happened, publicly, exactly once, in a way that left no doubt about either the capability or the restraint involved. Issei sat with that for a long moment, thinking about the courtyard, about Cassius Aldebaran's tears, about 30 armed devils withdrawing in a hurry, and about a story, spreading now across an entire region, that had started with a single decision to step out from behind a granary and say, politely, mind if I watch. I didn't think about it like that, he admitted. I just wanted to make sure nothing happened to that house, that day. I know, Grafiya said. And Issei, that is, I think, precisely why it worked the way it did. Every previous attempt at deterrence in the history of the underworld's politics has been built on calculated displays of strength, carefully managed for maximum political effect. What you did was not calculated. It was simply, plainly, what it appeared to be. And people, even people accustomed to a lifetime of political theater, can usually tell the difference, even if they cannot always articulate how. That evening, Issei stood in the courtyard beneath the violet trees, looking up at the painted stars, and found the Void Dragon Emperor's presence settling beside him, quiet and contemplative. You are thinking about something, the Emperor observed. I'm thinking about how much has changed, Issei said. A few months ago, I was floating alone in an empty void, wondering if I was about to die. Now there's some kind of story spreading across the whole southern underworld about a deterrent that protects entire regions, and apparently Rias told her whole peerage I'm alive. And Sona knows something happened even if she doesn't know what, and he trailed off, shaking his head slowly. It's a lot. It is, the Void Dragon Emperor agreed. And Issei, I think it is worth pausing, occasionally, simply to acknowledge that. Not everything that grows quickly is dangerous. Sometimes things grow quickly because they were needed, and the world, recognizing that need, makes room for them faster than anyone expected. Do you think it's going to keep growing? Issei asked. This place, I mean. What we're doing. The Void Dragon Emperor was quiet for a moment, and when it spoke again, its voice carried something Issei hadn't heard from it before, something that, had it come from anyone else, he might have called wistful. I think, it said slowly, that for a very long time, I existed only as a fear. A thing erased from history because the people who erased me could not imagine what I might become, if I were ever allowed to exist freely. They assumed, because my power could unmake things, that unmaking was all I was for. Concept erasure, they called it, as though erasure were my purpose, rather than simply one half of what I was capable of. The violet light of the courtyard deepened, very slightly, the blossoms overhead glowing a little brighter. But Genesis, the Emperor continued creation, the bringing into being of things that did not exist before, that was always there too. Always paired with erasure, the way every ending is paired with a beginning. And I think, Issei, that for 2 centuries, nobody, not even the people who built their entire understanding of me around the concept of erasure, ever stopped to wonder what I might create, if I were ever given the chance, and a host whose heart was inclined toward building rather than destroying. You think that's what this is, Issei said quietly. Not just me surviving. Not just building a sanctuary. You think this is what you were always supposed to become, if things had gone differently. I think, the Void Dragon Emperor said, that 2 centuries ago, the world looked at the concept of erasure, and decided it could only ever mean an ending. And I think, Issei Hyodo, that you and I together, are in the process of proving that even the most feared concepts can, given the right circumstances, and the right person, become something else entirely. A beginning instead. For more people than either of us could have imagined, when we first found ourselves alone in an empty void, with nothing but each other, and a single block of crystal, and the question of what we wanted to build. Issei looked up at the painted stars, at the violet light spreading gently across the courtyard, and thought about Grafiya, and Serafall, and Rosweiss, and Zenobia, each of them sleeping somewhere in this palace tonight, safe, for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, and about Sona, and Rias, and an old man named Cassius Aldebrand, each of them, in their own way, a little safer too. Because of a story that had started with erasure, and become, instead, something else. Yeah, Issei said quietly, smiling up at the stars he had made himself, all those months ago, in the dark. I think you're right. Chapter 24, The Growing Table. 3 weeks after House Aldebrand, the Forbidden Palace had grown enough that Issei had, for the first time, started keeping a written map of his own, alongside Grafia's increasingly detailed administrative records and Serafall's cheerfully illustrated editions. A new wing had taken shape almost on its own, Issei realized one morning, walking through halls he didn't entirely remember building, a long gallery of guest rooms, each subtly different, each with the same quality he had noticed in his very first rooms, the sense that whoever had designed it had been thinking, very specifically, about a particular kind of person, even if that person didn't exist yet. You're building for people who haven't arrived, Rosweiss observed, joining him on his walk through the new wing, her expression thoughtful. Issei, do you realize you're doing that? I guess I am, Issei said, a little surprised by the observation. Is that weird? No, Rosweiss said. I think it might be the opposite of weird. I think, Issei, you've started to understand something about this place that even Grafiya and Serafall, with all their political experience, haven't quite articulated yet. What's that? This place isn't just a sanctuary anymore, Rosweiss said. It hasn't been, for a while now. A sanctuary is somewhere people go to escape something. But Issei, look at what's actually happened here. Grafiya didn't just escape the underworld's politics. She's been actively shaping a new approach to them, from here. Serafall didn't just escape a system that discarded her, she helped end the consolidation proposal that would have hurt houses she's spent her whole life trying to protect. I didn't just escape a death sentence, I've spent the last few months helping build something that's actively making the underworld safer for people who have no idea this place even exists. She gestured around them, at the new wing, at its quiet, waiting rooms. This isn't a place people come to hide anymore, she said. It's becoming a place people come to, because from here, they can finally do the things the system never let them do, while they were inside it. Issei thought about that, about Grafia's morning briefings, about Serafall's sharp political instincts finally finding somewhere they could be used without compromise, about Rosweiss' research, once a desperate act of self-preservation, now a quiet, ongoing project that had already protected dozens of people either of them had ever met. You're right, he said slowly. I didn't think about it like that. But yeah. That's exactly what's happening, isn't it? It is, Rosweiss said. And Issei, I think that's why the palace keeps growing, even when you're not actively thinking about it. Because on some level, whether you've articulated it to yourself yet or not, you already know. There are going to be more people. Not just people who need rescuing, the way Zenobia did, or the way I did. People who hear about this place, eventually, The way Sona apparently did, in pieces, through stories that don't quite explain themselves, and who start to wonder quietly whether there might be a door somewhere that opens when it needs to. They walked in silence for a while, through halls that glowed softly with light that came from nowhere, past rooms that waited, patiently, for people who didn't yet know they would one day need them. Issei, Roswise said eventually, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more careful. There's something I wanted to ask you. Something I've been thinking about, since House Aldebrand. What's that? The deterrent, Roswise said. It's spreading. Houses along the border are starting to feel safer, just from the story alone, the way Grafiya said they would. But Issei, I've been doing some additional research, since the incident, and I think there might be a pattern forming. Not the old pattern, the one we found before. Something new. What kind of pattern? Houses that hear the story, Roswise said slowly, and start to wonder if the deterrent might extend to them too, even informally, even just through the existence of the story itself, are starting to behave differently. More confidently. Pushing back, in small ways, against pressure they would have simply accepted before. And Issei, some of that pressure is coming from factions that, until recently, were used to that kind of quiet, low-level intimidation working, every time, without exception. So some of those factions are getting frustrated, Issei said slowly, beginning to see where this was going. Some of them are getting frustrated, Roswise agreed. And Issei, frustrated factions, the same way frightened factions did before, sometimes look for someone to blame. Someone specific. A symbol, maybe, of everything that's changed, that they can point to, and say, this is the source of all our problems, and if we could just deal with this, everything would go back to normal. You think someone's going to come after the palace directly, Issei said? Or after one of us? I think, Roswise said carefully, that it's only a matter of time before someone, somewhere, decides that the safest way to deal with a deterrent they can't reach, is to try to find a way to reach it anyway. And Issei, I don't know what that would look like yet. I don't have a name, or a date, the way I did with Zenobia. Just a feeling. A sense that things have been going well, for a while now, and that things going well, in the underworld's politics, has a way of not lasting as long as anyone hopes. Issei was quiet for a long moment, looking around at the new wing, at its waiting rooms, at the palace that had grown, slowly, deliberately, from a single block of crystal into something that now, apparently, cast a shadow long enough to make entire factions nervous. Then I guess, he said finally, we keep doing what we've been doing. Watching. Being ready. And making sure, whatever comes next, that we're not the only ones who get to decide how this place is seen. That's a good plan, Roswise said. But Issei, there's one more thing. Something I noticed, going through the records again, that I think you should know. What is it? The original addendum, Roswise said. The one that started all of this, the one that recommended your exile. It was signed by representatives of all three biblical factions, working in secret cooperation. We've dealt with the devil faction's involvement, through Valserius. We've dealt with the consequences spreading through the southern border territories. But Issei, the angels, and the church, the other two factions involved in that original decision, we haven't heard much from either of them, since the message was delivered. You think that's strange? I think, Roswise said slowly, that two factions, who were part of the original decision to exile you, who received the same message everyone else did, and who have had 2 months to react to everything that's happened since, choosing to stay almost completely silent, is either a very good sign, or a very concerning one. And Issei, I don't think we'll know which, until something happens that forces one of them to show their hand. Issei looked out through a nearby window, crystal clear and impossibly tall, at the endless black of the dimensional gap beyond, dotted now with the faint, distant glow of structures Issei had built, room by room, over months that felt, somehow, both impossibly long and impossibly short. Then I guess, he said quietly, we wait. And we watch. And whatever happens next, whoever it is, however it comes, we make sure this place is ready for it. Behind him, the violet trees of the courtyard swayed gently in a wind that did not exist, and somewhere, far above, in two quiet, careful organizations that had said nothing, done nothing, and revealed nothing since the message arrived, something was, very slowly, beginning to move.